Dead Space is one of those franchises whose reputation precedes it. It's widely regarded as not only some of the greatest horror games of all time, but some of the greatest games of all time. Even as somebody who's never been a fan of the horror genre, I've still recognized Dead Space's critical acclaim, just like Silent Hill 2 and the original Resident Evil games, both of which I've never played. After having played the games, I can safely say this has become one of my favorite science fiction franchises of all time. These games deserve every bit of praise that they've received, and that includes Dead Space 3. I have the most to say about that game, and it has the most flaws. It was also the most inconsistent experience I had with these games, which means my impressions were more than a little mixed. I think it had the potential to be the best in the series, but I wasn't able to reach it for various reasons that we'll get into later. Those of you who hate the game should feel vindicated, but hopefully you'll also see the potential that was always there. With that said, let's go ahead and get into it. My impressions of Dead Space as a franchise are most likely very different than yours. I can't be the only person who feels the way I do about the games, but I also recognize that I don't represent the majority either. Something that I should get off my chest right here in the beginning is that I didn't find any of these games scary. There were certainly some tense moments and a handful of jump scares got me, but I was never truly scared while playing these games. The first game is firmly the most horror in the series and has the greatest atmosphere, but I was shocked by how little the game actually managed to scare me. I think this stems from a deeper problem that has to do with me personally. I'm not really able to establish an emotional connection to most games, and those that rely on it end up falling flat as a result. I'm not sure whether this is because I'm viewing these games through a critical lens, or if the medium just can't connect to me the same way that others do, but it's something that has become more and more apparent over time. This obviously isn't all-inclusive, seeing as the ending section in Metro Exodus had me more on edge than anything in the Dead Space games, but that can be attributed to how much it contrasts from the rest of the game. So let's settle this debate before it begins. Is Dead Space scary? The answer is a firm yes, but not to me. I can't deny many of the obvious horror elements that have been put into the game. The atmosphere, while strongest in the first game, is still present in all three of them. Even if I wasn't scared while traversing the environments, I was always vigilant because I knew that enemies could come from anywhere and I needed to be prepared. It's also likely that this vigilance meant I was always ready for the jump scares the game throws at you, so they weren't able to have the effect that was intended. Despite that, it still needs to be said that the Dead Space games, the first one especially, are very scary to a lot of people. It's important for me to make this distinction for many reasons. I never felt much of the horror in these action horror games, so all that was left was the action, and that alone carried much of the gameplay for me, compounding with each installment until eventually outweighing the horror elements in Dead Space 3. To somebody like me, this meant that the third game offered the most of what I enjoyed about the experience, which is one of the reasons I enjoyed it despite its numerous flaws. The best way I can describe the Dead Space games is by comparing them to another franchise I'm fond of, Mass Effect. You see, Dead Space and Mass Effect have a lot in common. They share more than a leash to their publisher. Both of them are third-person action games that are still something else beneath the surface, and that something else is slowly stripped away with each installment in favor of more action elements. The first Mass Effect is firmly an RPG first and an action game second. This can be seen in its mechanics and how it has a greater emphasis on character building and player choice. The first Dead Space is firmly a horror game first and an action game second. This can be seen in how it uses the atmosphere and combat to create a strong sense of isolation. Mass Effect 2 shifted its focus in favor of letting player skill determine the outcome of battles, and weapon accuracy is firmly within the player's control instead of being tied to character stats. Dead Space 2 does something similar by improving its gunplay and having a stronger focus on combat, although it's not near as much of a step from the first game as Mass Effect 2 was. Both of these games feel like a significant improvement to make the experience much more enjoyable. Mass Effect 3 takes the combat further by including a dodge roll and forcing the player to move around more often than was necessary in the second game. Dead Space 3 also offers a dodge roll and introduces light cover mechanics in human enemies. Both of these games look and feel so similar that I was convinced that they were created in the same engine, but they weren't. Dead Space 3 even has an N7 suit that can be unlocked if you have a Mass Effect 3 save file on your system. There's also the interesting contrast between the franchise's respective protagonists. In many ways, Isaac Clarke is almost the antithesis of Commander Shepard. Isaac is an engineer, Shepard is a soldier. Shepard is committed to stopping the Reaper invasion at all costs, and he's willing to lay down his life for the good of everybody else. Isaac not only rejects his responsibility to seek out and prevent future Necromorph outbreaks, he runs from it. He makes it clear that he wants nothing to do with anything regarding the Necromorphs and is often pulled into these situations against his will. Once he's there, he's committed to seeing things to their conclusion, but he does so begrudgingly. Shepard seems unfazed by the crushing weight he carries throughout the games and has only shown small signs of psychological trauma. Isaac is scarred by the events of the first game and never fully recovers from it. He appears to be much better off in the third game than the second, but that's mostly because a major recurring theme from the previous games was cut in Dead Space 3. There's likely many more of these differences that could be found that I didn't even notice. I don't think that any of these were intentional. I'm not saying that Visceral looked at the runaway success of the Mass Effect games and then made changes to be more comparable to it, but I do find these details interesting, and I'm not the only person who's noticed so many similarities. Whether or not these similarities stem from pressure by EA or because they stand in the third-person action genre is unclear, but I found these things interesting nonetheless. Getting back on track, each Dead Space game has seen a progressive shift in focus from horror to action without fully ditching the horror elements altogether. I go back and forth about whether the second or third game has the best combat, but I can see an argument for both of them. I think the third game is heavily limited by some questionable design choices, but I think the overall jankiness probably pushes people towards the second game. None of them fully resolve a lot of the problems I have with the series, although the second game was such a significant improvement over the first that it was impossible for me not to have a better time overall. The narrative goes through a similar metamorphosis, although this is where the comparisons to Mass Effect officially end. For now, Isaac in the first Dead Space game is a silent protagonist, which is a decision that I don't think works for the series. He doesn't find his voice until the second game, and I think it's a much better fit. I think Isaac is a very likable protagonist who was undeniably missing a proper character in the first game, but he's given more than enough development in the second game to make you forget about it by the third. Aside from Isaac's character, the progression of Dead Space's story and the expansion of its world after the events of the first game is suitably impressive. I couldn't find any significant retcons in the lore, although I hardly read every text log I came across. I made a better attempt with audio logs and listened to any of those I could find, but none of them dip into heavy retcon territory. That's not to say that the lore is seamless, and there are many questions that feel unanswered even after the numerous explanations the games give. This is where the horror elements become the glue that holds this story together. It's okay that not everything is explained for the explicit reason that this is a horror franchise, and there needs to be at least some amount of mystery for the Necromorphs to remain a menacing threat. Some of the concepts behind the Necromorphs are existential, and you're not meant to understand everything about them. With each game, the stakes are suitably raised. The first game turns out to be rather small scale compared to what happens in the later entries, but it's a strong foundation that the writers built on going forward, even if they did fumble things quite a bit with the third game and left off with one of the least satisfying endings for any game that I've ever played in my entire life. Now really isn't the best time to talk about how the franchise ends, but I do at least want to touch on the fact that you're not going to get a satisfying resolution for the overarching story, and that's a real shame. However, the possibility is still there with a new studio developing a remake for the first game. I initially had some reservations about a new studio making a game in a franchise that wasn't technically theirs, but after doing some more research, I was able to come around. Motive Studios isn't just some no-name developer taking the reins of this project. I stumbled across an article on their website where they expressed their love for the franchise and tell the passion that much of the team has. Some members joined the studio specifically to work on Dead Space, one of these being the art director from Dead Space 2 who still has his old notebooks from that project that contain things like concept art, visual guides, source material, conversations they had with Visceral while they helped them make the game, and much more. He has stated that all this is going into the remake to keep it true to its roots. With that context, I think it's safe to say that the remake is in good hands, but the only way we'll know for sure is when we get a chance to play it. At the very least, it's good to know that the people working on the remake respect the game as much as the fans do. So, as you can tell, the Dead Space games have gone through a bit of an evolution with each installment. For a lot of people, these changes were for the worse, but I couldn't help but feel like some of them were for the better. None of this would have been possible if it wasn't for the first game, and one man's vision to create the scariest game of all time. We're getting dangerously close to spoiler territory, so here's your warning to turn back now. The Dead Space games are absolutely something that are best played with no prior knowledge of the events. If you're a fan of the horror genre, then you owe it to yourself to play these games. You'll likely find the first one to be the best in the series, although you may still find enjoyment out of the second and third. For everybody else, let's get into it. The first Dead Space game was my least favorite of these games to play through. Most of the issues I have with it are due to its mechanics and the amount of backtracking you have to do throughout the game. The reason I felt the second game was such a step up in quality is because it's mostly linear and still manages to capture a similar atmosphere as its predecessor. Linearity isn't a virtue in and of itself, but I tended to get lost a lot while playing through the first game. I think a good balance was struck between openness and linearity in the third game, but let's save that for later. I didn't enjoy this first game as much as I did the later entries, but this game is undoubtedly the most successful in achieving what it set out to do. Glenn Schofield, the founder of Sledgehammer Games and the former general manager and vice president of Visceral, wanted to create the scariest game ever made, and he arguably succeeded at that. To a majority of people who played it, this is one of the scariest games of its era, and I think it deserves recognition for this even if it never scared me personally. There are a lot of things that build to this. I touched on some of these earlier, but I think they're worth repeating so I can go into more detail about it. Dead Space has an atmosphere like no other. Not even the Metro games come close, and if you've seen my video on them, then you know how much I love the atmosphere in that franchise as well. A lot of care went into making the setting more than just a derelict ship, and there are details that even I'd forgotten about by the time I reached the third game, and anybody who's ignoring it is missing a large part of the experience. Glenn Schofield mentioned in an interview how sound design was one of the biggest focuses while making the game, and it shows. It's often hard to tell if what you're hearing is coming from the ship or the monsters within it. Just listening to some of the ambient noises for a few minutes shows how much care went into them. Probably the best example is another one given by Glenn Schofield in that interview, and I think the best explanation comes from the man himself.
One in particular that really got me was the bar train room. Don Vecca was telling me one day, he's like, Glenn, I was going in the bar train. We went under the bay, and it's the worst sound in the history of man, or something like that. And I'm like, record it. Next day, he's hanging out the bar train, getting the sound when it's in the tunnel and everything. And he plays it for me, and we have these really nice sound rooms. It was like screeching, and I'm like, oh man, it's great, you know? Because what we were looking for is how can we scare people just with sound? No monster, no nothing.
This clip gives us a lot of information about the thought process behind Dead Space's sound design. My favorite inclusion, and the ones that got under my skin the most, were the quiet whispers that can be heard in the background, reinforcing that Isaac is slowly losing his mind throughout the course of the game. The visuals also contribute heavily to the atmosphere in this game. You don't need to be the smartest person alive to intuit that the Necromorph outbreak was a bloodbath, but there's more to this game's visual design than just gore. Many of the areas in this game are very low lit, and raising the brightness doesn't seem to really change that. Those of you watching this outside on a sunny day are probably going to be staring at a black screen for most of this section due to how dark the areas are, and your tool's flashlight does very little to help. This not only makes combat more tense, although I found it more frustrating than anything, it also serves to put a bigger focus on the sound design as you're now forced to listen for enemies since you can't see them. Not every area is perpetually dark, but quite a few of them are, and even most of the areas that do have suitable lighting don't offer enough for it to really be comfortable. Then, there's the Necromorphs themselves. Each one is disturbing in its own way, mostly because they still vaguely resemble the people that they've infected, but the way they're used is more important than their visual design. The enemies in this game use the vents to travel around, and if you'll forgive me for using another clip from that interview with Glenn Schofield, there's some great innovation in how this was implemented.
If we had a vent here and a vent here, depending on where the character was, is where the enemy came out. So what we were trying to do in many cases was the enemy would come out a vent and we go, oh shoot, back up. That starts another enemy coming out of the other vent. Just by innovating a little bit on the way spawn points are, you can really get something special.
This is a detail that I never really noticed while playing, likely because I only did one playthrough, but I did notice after reloading a checkpoint that sometimes enemies wouldn't spawn the way that they did previously, and this is likely why. The Necromorphs are disturbing, but somehow they're not near as bad as the survivors you can find around the ship, many of which either commit suicide on the spot or have completely lost their mind. I found these encounters to be even creepier than those with the Necromorphs, but I probably wouldn't feel that way if the game had let me kill them so I could put them out of their misery. It really adds to the what the hell is even going on here vibe that the entire game has, and they elevate the experience much more than if there had been no survivors at all. It reinforces that sense of isolation since you and your small crew are seemingly the only sane people left on this ship, and even that is rapidly changing as you all start becoming more and more delusional. I found the encounters with these survivors to be far creepier than any Necromorph in the game, including the bosses. All these elements come together to make Dead Space's atmosphere one of the greatest I've ever seen in a game, and it's something that I have come to appreciate even more after spending so much time with the third game. Visceral absolutely knocked it out of the park in this regard, and it deserves every bit of praise and recognition that it's received. This part of the game is timeless and will always feel as good as it did when it was created, but the same can't be said about the game's mechanics. This area of the game brought the experience down more than anything else in it, but let's talk about some things that it does right before we get into what it does poorly. For starters, the UI is one of the best I've ever seen in a game. It immerses you into the experience about as much as a third-person action game possibly could. The lasers help you line up shots on specific body parts without requiring too much thought, and you may not even realize how great it feels until you're given the option to play without it in Dead Space 2 and beyond. You can clearly see how much health and ammo you have, and even having the inventory or map open is something that happens in real time. These feel like extensions of Isaac's equipment, not a UI for a video game. Care went into making these elements feel as immersive as possible, and the only complaint I have with the system is that it feels too awkward to control on PC. Even up to the third game, you'll never be allowed to use the mouse cursor to select menu options, even if it feels like you really should be. There are so few exceptions to this rule that it's not even really worth mentioning. The series feels undeniably geared towards consoles, and it's probably not worth criticizing these games for not having tweaked UIs for PCs, but it is worth mentioning that these could feel awkward to control at times, especially the workbenches in Dead Space 3. Other notable mechanics include stores and upgrade stations. These are pretty straightforward and didn't need as much work put into them as the other UI elements did. You collect credits as you explore levels that can be used to purchase equipment and consumables. The first game is the only one in the series where higher levels of your suit can be purchased. Every other game sells you complete suits that offer slight bonuses in Dead Space 2 and are only cosmetically different in Dead Space 3. You also collect power nodes that can be used at a workbench to upgrade your gear. These can be used to make your weapons more powerful or grant you more health or oxygen for certain areas that require you to go into space. I never found it necessary to upgrade my oxygen in any of these games because you're given more than enough time to get through them without dying, although some areas did require me to use the spare oxygen tanks that I'd collected to stay alive. Beyond that, I never had a problem with it. I also felt like there weren't enough power nodes to get all the upgrades I wanted, and I never wanted to resort to purchasing them from the store since they were so expensive. Power nodes can also be used to access emergency supply rooms around the ship. These offer randomly generated loot that usually ranges from health and ammo to the occasional schematic to unlock more items in the store. I generally found them to be a waste of a power node, but there were a few times when I was close to death or low on ammo when I was willing to spend one just to see if they had what I needed. I played the game on normal mode and noticed that it would usually cheat and provide you with resources you were low on to keep you in the fight longer, while also only providing ammo for weapons you had in your inventory. This was another feature I took for granted until Dead Space 2 and 3, where the games loaded me up with so many health packs that I could brute force my way through almost every encounter, before being sent into a panic when I used too many of them and needed to hope that there was a workbench nearby so I could pull another 20 out of storage. Inventory management was handled much better in this game than it was in the rest of the series. You don't need to spend nearly as much time sorting your inventory in the first game as you do in the later entries, especially Dead Space 2 since it can drop ammo for weapons you don't even have unlocked yet. The few moments that you do feel few and far between, and you will seldom remain comfortably stocked on supplies for any length of time, even on normal mode. There were many times that I would load up on ammo before heading on to the next level just to deplete it all by the end of it, and I would often need to start scavenging, so I never had to spend too much time looking at my inventory screen deliberating on what I was going to drop to make space. And this brings us to the beginning of this game's combat analysis, so let's go ahead and start off with the basics. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the franchise, you do additional damage to enemies by severing their limbs. They can still be killed by shooting them in the body, but it's hardly the most reliable way to do so. This means that combat is mostly based around managing your limited resources by landing a few precise shots on an enemy as opposed to unloading everything into them. The combat system is designed to punish you for panicking, although there are other reasons that you can end up burning through your ammo. Dead Space has one crippling flaw that I found impossible to reconcile while playing. The combat in this game doesn't feel comfortable. To the right person, this would only add to the element of horror as you now have an additional handicap on top of resource management, but the number of fights the game throws at you only emphasized how much I despise this game's combat. I mentioned in my Metro video how the longer shooting gallery sections clashed with the resource management instead of complementing it, and I felt the same way about Dead Space. But the issue isn't just that running out of ammo due to a long stretch of battles is annoying, it's that shooting itself feels off. The PC port of Dead Space has a problem where the mouse sensitivity is tied directly to the game's frame rate in VSync, which can cause a multitude of issues depending on what's going on. I left VSync turned on while playing, which meant that the controls were consistently sluggish, but as you can see by the footage I'm showing, some areas show the sensitivity spiking in certain areas. I've also read that this can break the game's physics if the frame rate is too high. This issue isn't unique to Dead Space, it's referred to as frame rate dependency in game design, which basically means that various objects in the game run at the same speed of the current frame rate. You can see this in Bethesda games with how physics break whenever you increase the frame rate too much. Ideally, you would want your game to be frame rate independent, but it's not unheard of for games to be built in this way. There's a mod that fixes this problem for the PC port that I didn't learn about until after this playthrough, and this undeniably hindered my enjoyment of this game immensely. This isn't the only thing that makes gameplay feel uncomfortable though. The fact that you can't do simple things like reload while sprinting gets old very quickly too. This isn't near as bad as some of the issues I had while playing Dead Space 3, but these moments brought the experience down over my roughly 9-hour playthrough of this game. But just because it brought the experience down doesn't mean it ruined it completely. I was sick of the combat by the end of the game, but I wasn't sick of the game, and Dead Space is still great. It's because of these limitations that I can't say the game is my favorite in the series, but I can recognize it for its success far more than its flaws, and few things about this game are as successful as its story. Dead Space's story isn't without its own flaws, but it's impossible to deny that it's told very well. I can only imagine how memorable some of the twists in this game were back when nobody knew anything about it. I went into this game with a lot of prior knowledge regarding its story, so these twists had a minimal impact on me as a result, but the ones that I didn't know about managed to stand out and were very memorable. The biggest criticism I even have about Dead Space's story is that the middle portion can drag a little, but it doesn't take very long for the game to pick back up. It's a shame that it couldn't have the same level of consistency in its pacing as the second game, although I may just feel that way because I beat it 3 hours quicker than I did the first and didn't get lost near as often. I don't have much to say that's divorced from the game's plot, so let's go ahead and get into it. The game begins with a mission log explaining your objectives. You're a small maintenance team being sent to the mining vessel USG Ishimura to find out why it's gone dark and repair its communications. You see Isaac watching a recording from his girlfriend, Nicole. You're then introduced to your mostly forgettable supporting cast, Kendra and Hammond. You get some background about the Ishimura as Hammond explains that it's the biggest planet mining vessel in existence. Disaster quickly strikes as you try to dock inside the ship. The Ishimura's automatic docking mechanics were damaged and you're forced to crash land your shuttle. Kendra shouts at Hammond for not trying to stop the shuttle from docking whenever it became clear they were going to crash, and he responds by saying that they would have crashed into the side of the hole if they tried. This begins the game-spanning conflict where Kendra bitches at Hammond for something while he does what he can to try and keep the team alive, all while Isaac runs around doing all the work. Disaster strikes again as the Necromorphs murder the only 2 crew members here without a name. This is one of 2 moments in the game where Isaac could have saved somebody's life if he was allowed to speak, but since he's a silent protagonist, they had to die. Look at how much time he had to warn this guy about the Necromorph behind him, but decides to just stand there staring at him instead.
I don't know, something's in the room with us.
Jesus! Open fire! Open fire! Get the power!
There aren't many contrivances like this in this game, but there are a couple that are worth pointing out. Kendra and Hammond escape through the elevator while the Necromorphs start chasing you. You barely make it into an elevator yourself, then you watch as the one chasing you decides to run away instead of cornering you and finishing the job. It then waits until the elevator doors are shut to pry them back open once it realizes it was supposed to take a left turn at Albuquerque and gets sliced in half, killing it. You then get the plasma cutter, arguably the best weapon in all 3 games, and make your way to the tram system. Once you arrive, you see that Hammond and Kendra are still alive. Seeing as they're the only 2 named NPCs you've met, this shouldn't come as a shock. Kendra tells you that the tram needs to be repaired. You need to find a new data board and clear a wrecked tram that is blocking the tracks further ahead. Hammond tells you that if you repair the tram, he'll help you find Nicole. You pick up a stasis module and use it to slow a malfunctioning door enough to pass through it. This is a simple yet effective way to communicate how stasis works to the player, so puzzles can build on this concept, starting with this next one where you try to remove the wrecked tram. Hammond tells you to go back to the flight deck and prep your shuttle to launch. Things go south quickly as it explodes whenever you try to start it up. This causes Kendra to freak out, and Hammond tries to get access to the command computer. There's an executive lockdown in place, and the only person who can lift it is the captain. He's already dead, but you can get the codes off his rig if you can find his body in the med lab. They're then attacked by more Necromorphs, so you make your way there and try to find the captain. There's not much to comment on for these missions, so I won't bother padding it out. I'll only be remarking on important details going forward. You learn in this mission that Hammond is alive. He and Kendra were split up and he doesn't know if she also survived. You get a kinesis module and receive a short introduction similar to how Stasis did in the first level. You're also introduced to zero gravity movement, and I'm mostly neutral about this. I prefer its later iterations, but it's not bad in this game either. Once you find the captain and send the codes over, you start making your way to the tram. Hammond says that he caught one of the Necromorphs and trapped it in a damaged escape pod. He learned from the ship's logs that they came from the planet whenever the Ishimura began mining it, and it isn't an infection, it's an alien life form. He then tells you that the ship's engines are offline and you need to repair them to stabilize the ship's orbit. To do this, you need to head to engineering. This is the general structure of the story in this game. You take the tram to a part of the ship, solve a more self-contained problem to access other areas of the region, do some combat and puzzles, then return to the tram whenever you've handled a larger issue that sent you there. What you're doing usually consists of boring fetch quests, but they've been given enough thought and development to make it feel more engaging. Hammond radios you when you arrive and says that you need to get more fuel in the engines and then restart the gravity centrifuge. Once you've done both of these and start to make your way back, we come to the section that almost killed this game. The tentacle grab is one of the best moments where the game throws something completely unexpected at you. There's no strong indication before now that this tentacle is going to come at you, and it's a genuinely good surprise. I already knew about it before I played the game because I'd seen that interview with Glenn Schofield I keep referencing, but I have a greater appreciation for this section just knowing that it took months of work to implement. It was also an important moment in Glenn's career as it taught him how to more effectively tackle difficult problems going forward, which meant that future difficulties in this game were handled much easier. And since they were able to successfully implement this scene, they were able to use it in more interesting ways going forward. You're then contacted by Kendra, who is, unfortunately, very much alive and well. She barricaded herself in the computer core, which puts her in the prime position to access all the ship's main systems. She tells you some things she found while searching through the ship's logs. Even before the planet was cracked open, the crew were suffering widespread dementia. She says it was likely related to an artifact that was found on the planet that they called the Marker. After restarting the engines, Hammond says he's going to take you further out of orbit, and Kendra warns you that the asteroid defense system is offline, and the Ishimura won't be able to handle the amount of damage it would sustain from the debris field. Hammond tells you to meet him on the bridge so you can work out what to do next. As you make your way back to the tram, you're contacted by Nicole, who asks where you are. This is another one of those situations where Isaac being a silent protagonist hurts the believability a little bit, because there's absolutely no way that Isaac wouldn't respond to her if he could talk. She doesn't say anything else, and this is mostly meant to communicate to the player that Nicole is alive and somewhere on the ship. Once you made it to the command deck, Kendra immediately starts accusing Hammond of knowing something about the marker prior to their arrival. Hammond says that it's referenced in the captain's logs and is currently in cargo, but he has no idea what it is. She outright accuses him of lying, and he tells her to back off. He still tries to keep the group together and reinforces that he didn't know anything about it when you meet him on the bridge. He says this was supposed to be a simple repair mission and nothing more. He then tells you that you'll need to go manually reroute power to the asteroid defense system. He then warns you about something really big that he saw on the ship before he took shelter in the bridge. As you're making your way out, the Necromorph he trapped in the escape pod starts causing a ruckus, so he jettisons the pod. I was initially confused whenever I saw this part because he had mentioned earlier that the pod had malfunctioned, but I later realized that all he did was release it from the ship. The controls inside the escape pod may not have been working. You're then attacked by one of the larger Juggernaut Necromorphs that Hammond warned you about. After killing it, you get contacted by Nicole as she tells you to make us whole again. It's said very ominously and likely doesn't make any sense if this is your first time hearing that. You then proceed to the elevator where you see a video of how the captain died. He was declared unfit for duty by Dr. Kine as he pleads for the marker to be delivered to the church. He then calls Kine a traitor and a heretic before he shoves a needle in his eye. Kine responds with disbelief whenever the crew turns on him and has him arrested. With just the context of the first game, this makes Kine look like a psychopath, but it's amazing how much sense this scene makes with context of the second game, although it's unlikely that this was planned from the start. Once you reroute the power, you're told to go shoot the cannon manually until they can get the auto-targeting system back online. You make your way there and get a short minigame that consists of you shooting down asteroids. Once the auto-targeting is rebooted, you head back to the elevator where you're told that oxygen levels in the ship are dropping. Something is poisoning hydroponics and is filling the deck with organic matter found in the Necromorphs, which is contaminating the oxygen supply. Thankfully, she can show you how to create a poison that can kill it and halt the contamination. She tells you to go back to medical so you can get the ingredients you need. Hammond says he's heading to hydroponics to see if he can slow the contamination rate and buy you some time. This next mission is my least favorite in the entire game. I'd say it's my least favorite in the entire series if the first half of Dead Space 3 wasn't so damn boring. When you return to the medical bay, you see that somebody has reprogrammed most of the doors. Once you reach the chemistry station, you're contacted by a Dr. Mercer, who essentially tells you that humanity is doomed and that you're going to die. He then releases a modified necromorph that can't be killed, who I've affectionately named Mr. Incredible. It will regenerate its limbs if you shoot them off, but you can turn it into a nugget and hit it with stasis to buy some time and get away. This is honestly the most tense that the entire game gets, as you're stuck in this room with an invincible enemy, but I felt the experience was brought down a little by the game's poor controls. This gets worse whenever you're put in a room with other enemies that you need to kill before Kendra can hack the doors and let you through, and I felt more annoyed throughout this portion than anything else. This is one of those things that are fine from a design standpoint that I just didn't like. Other than that, I imagine this is one of the more memorable moments from the game for those who played it. Most of this level involves you running around the medical bay trying to create the poison that can kill whatever is contaminating the air in hydroponics. Mercer will also taunt you several times throughout this level and tries to impede your progress by constantly reprogramming the doors. Once you get the final mixture, Mercer offers to show you the whole plan. He basically tells you that he's going to bring the Necromorphs back to Earth because he believes that it will save the human race. He then releases Mr. Incredible in the room with you, and you'd be forgiven if you don't fully understand what you're supposed to do at first. Since he can't be killed, you need to cryogenically freeze him to proceed, although you may not have noticed that the doors to the controls have unlocked since that's the same room that Mercer was in. Once you realize this, you freeze Mr. Incredible and move on. The first time I did this, what popped in my mind was surely burning it would be the only real way to stop this thing, since the only way to prevent it from regenerating is to make sure there are no more cells left to regenerate. But since the problem is now solved, you move on to hydroponics to kill whatever is contaminating the oxygen supply. Once you arrive, you see that Hammond is in bad shape but still alive. He tells you that the thing responsible, called the Leviathan, was huge and that it shut itself in food storage. He also says that the things polluting the air are infected crew members and you'll need to kill them to proceed. This took me a while before I even realized what I was supposed to be doing, mostly because I didn't listen to Hammond's instructions. Once you've killed all 8 of them, something that took me an hour to do, you proceed to food storage and flush it with the toxins that you created. This isn't enough to kill the Leviathan, but it weakens it enough for you to finish it off in a boss fight that is laughably easy with the contact beam. Once you've killed it, Kendra tells you that Hammond is nowhere to be found and it's up to you two to find a way off the Ishimura. She wants you to strap a distress beacon onto an asteroid and launch it into space in the hopes that somebody will find it. As you make your way back to the tram, you see that Hammond managed to get out of hydroponics, although it's unclear if the exposure he had to the contamination was enough to drive him insane or not. There's very little worth commenting on during this next mission. You spend the first half running around looking for a keycard to access other areas. Kendra tells you that the dementia the crew was experiencing began whenever they pulled the marker from the planet. You find Nicole as you make your way to find a beacon to attach to the asteroid. It's not clear how she survived down here for so long, although it's likely she found somewhere to hide like Kendra did and came out when she heard the gunshots. She tries to help you by unlocking the door to the storage room where the beacon can be found, which naturally means I try to kill her to see what happens. The answer is nothing. But it was a valiant effort. You protect her while she unlocks the door, and then she leaves, but not before she tells you that she loves you and that this will all be over soon. Kendra contacts you after you grab the beacon and says that she still hasn't heard from Hammond and that he's likely dead. You make it to the asteroid and place the beacon on it, which is easier said than done since I had absolutely no idea what the game wanted from me. It seems obvious now that I've done it. You need to place the beacon on the asteroid while avoiding the moving bits that can kill you, then destroy the gravity tether so you can launch it into space, but this had me lost for at least 10 minutes. You then head up to the control room to launch the asteroid in hopes that somebody will hear its signal. Kendra then contacts you and says the communications array is damaged and you'll need to fix it in order to hear any responses. You would think this is something we'd want to do first, especially since this was pointed out in the intro, but enough has happened since then that it probably slipped their mind. She contacts you again at the start of the next level. A ship called the USM Valor has responded to your distress signal, but you won't be able to communicate with them until you get the array back online. She later tells you that she's getting some weird feedback spikes on your local comms, and it's likely that someone is listening in on your conversations. You make it to the array and align the dishes so you can receive the broadcast from the USM Valor. They tell you that they picked up your escape pod and are on their way to assist. In case you'd forgotten by this point, Kendra will remind you that this is the same escape pod that Hammond jettisoned instead of letting you handle a single necromorph like you had up until this point. She tries to warn the Valor, but shoot. Another giant necromorph is attached to the hull and she can't get the blast doors open, which means she can't get a strong enough signal to respond to them. This was the moment when I stopped viewing these missions as problems that needed to be solved and started seeing them as fetch quests with more work put into their presentation. Thankfully, the path to the cannon is fairly short, and after you fight off the giant necromorph, Kendra starts broadcasting to the Valor. They respond just in time for you to see that you're too late. They open the escape pod and were slaughtered by what was inside. You then get to watch as the Valor crashes into the Ishimura. Isaac is knocked out for a while, but you wake up to see him and has finally contacted you. He says that somebody has been blocking his comms and the crash from the Valor disrupted their jamming signal enough for him to get through to you. He says that he found some medical supplies and patched himself up after the hydroponics incident, and he is finally ready to give up on the mission and try to escape. He found a shuttle on the crew deck that needs a new singularity core, but he thinks he can salvage one from the Valor. Kendra tells you to meet with Hammond and try to help, saying that he may not last long in his current condition. Hammond contacts you at the start of the next mission and says that the Valor doesn't look like it was here by coincidence. The ship appears to be prepped for war, and it's clear they were here on a seek and destroy mission. This makes you wonder why they couldn't handle a single necromorph, although it's possible that it caught them by surprise. Hammond's signal gets jammed again, and Kendra tells you to find the singularity core and get out of there. He contacts you later once you've reached the Valor and tells you that he's made it to the bridge and he's going to override all the door locks so you can get to the engine room, where he'll try and meet with you. You're then contacted by Dr. Kind shortly after, where he tells you that you can't use the shuttle to escape the ship or you'll condemn all humanity. He says the planet won't stop until the marker is returned. He then tells you that the church is wrong, this is all a trap, and he asks you to help him. This church has been referenced in many audio logs throughout the game so far, and it's the same one that the captain mentioned in the video earlier. You make it to the engine room and solve a puzzle that took me way too long to figure out. You need to use kinesis to push these large cylinder objects to guard you from the fire that the singularity core is putting off. You're supposed to shoot these fuses to stop the flames before grabbing the core, but you need to be close enough to the cylinder before the game will let you push it forward, so it only appears to move side to side at first. I didn't get close enough on my first try, so I ran forward and tried to grab the singularity core while spamming medkits every time Isaac caught on fire, but the game kills you with console commands if you get too close. It wasn't until after I rushed through the flames a second time to reach the hallway at the end that I realized I was doing something wrong. As much as I'd like to chalk this up to me being a moron, I do need to admit that the game wasn't very clear about what it was asking from you. This door at the end of the hallway shouldn't be accessible until after you solve this puzzle, and the cylinders you're using as cover should be more sensitive to your movements. It's not really that big of a deal, but I wanted to share this story anyways. Kendra contacts you when you grab the core and tells you to go to the crew deck and repair the shuttle. There was a power failure when you removed it from its housing, and you need to progress through the hallway I mentioned earlier. Hammond arrives and tells you that he's been trying to reach you, but his comm wasn't working again. He tells you that you need to get the singularity core to the shuttle and not wait for him. Then you watch as one of the larger necromorphs brutally kills him. This is another moment where Isaac could have said something instead of just watching him die, although it's not near as bad as the first example. I imagine that had he shouted that their back was the weak spot, it would have given Hammond a slight chance to fight back. back, although this thing clearly had him cornered and he would have died regardless. He doesn't have a stasis module like you do, so he didn't have much of a chance even if he knew how to avoid them. The beast then charges through the glass, and you're given a chance to avenge him. Kendra then messages you stating that she lost all of Hammond's vitals and expresses her shock that he's dead. I was actually impressed with how long these characters lived because I was convinced the game was going to kill them off after the first few missions. The two nameless goons dying in the beginning didn't help this either. Kendra contacts you at the start of the next mission and says that the shuttle Hammond found is missing its navigation cards. There are 3 of them scattered around the deck, and you need to find them before you can use it to leave. You later see Mercer in the next room with somebody named Temple. This was a character who left a majority of the audio logs you find around the Ishimura. Temple's story is interesting because it's a reflection of Isaac's. He was an engineer who survived longer than anybody else and set out to find his girlfriend, Dr. Cross. He eventually finds her, but it's heavily implied that he died with the rest of the survivors at an area where they were gathering after the outbreak. This is the same part of the ship where you find Nicole when looking for the beacon. Here you have a character that is just as knowledgeable and resourceful as Isaac with a very similar goal, but ends up dying at the hands of a lunatic doctor who worships the Necromorphs. He kills Temple the same way that Kyne killed the captain, by stabbing him in the eye with a needle, a detail that many players probably don't realize in their first playthrough and are unlikely to question if there's a connection between them. Like any good person would, I decide to nip this problem at the bud and sever Temple's limbs to make sure he doesn't have a chance to turn into a Necromorph and try to kill me later. Kyne contacts you again and says that he's close to your position and wants to meet with you. He says that he can explain exactly what happened to the Ishimura and urges you to find the navigation cards and meet him at the security station. You can find a text log in this level that sheds some light on the religion that keeps being referenced here called Unitology, but I'll come back to this later. You'll see a recording of Mercer in the next area where he explains to his fellow Unitologist how the marker and the Necromorphs are part of God's plan, and the audience responds with rejection and terror to his words. The next room consists of using kinesis to move these bunks so you can make a path forward, and once you pick up the nav card, Mercer tells you that he freed Mr. Incredible and releases him into the room with you. This was one of the rare moments in this game where I was legitimately on edge. I don't think that the regenerator will follow you back through the bunks, and I think I may have missed a quicker way out of there, but trying to open a path forward while sealing the way I came before it got to me was undeniably a tense moment. I imagine this is how most of the game feels for those who've played it, and it's a shame I only got to catch a glimpse of that. However, the game once again shits itself immediately after by putting you in another forced combat encounter with Mr. Incredible, while the invisible timer runs in the background until Kendra gets the doors unlocked. I ran out of health kits in this part and was killed in a hallway during the delay for one of the doors to open. There's a save station in this hallway that I used, and I thought the game was going to put me in a death loop, but lucked out whenever I respawned and the enemies weren't aggroed. Still, just like the engine room puzzle, this was annoying enough to warrant talking about. Again, there's nothing mechanically wrong with this encounter, and it gives you access to a shop immediately after so you can purchase some health packs. After picking up the final nav card, Kyne tells you to meet him in the executive area, and Kendra tells you to be careful since he's clearly lost his mind. You go to meet with him and hear him talking about somebody named Amelia who isn't there, showing that he's been hallucinating. He tells you that escape is impossible because the shuttle shock point drive is damaged. This is Dead Space's equivalent to hyperspace or faster than light speed. He tells you that he was the one who sabotaged so many of the Ishimura systems until Amelia changed things for him. It's unclear what exactly he means by this, but it'll make sense going forward. He then tells you that the church thinks the marker is divine, and he shows you footage of something that was released when it was removed from the planet, a giant necromorph bigger than anything we've seen so far. He explains that it was found in the core of the planet. Mercer calls it the hive mind, and it controls the necromorphs telepathically. The marker was keeping it sealed within the planet, so returning it is the key to stopping the crisis for good. Kyne takes responsibility for his actions and says he's ready to atone for them by helping you return the marker. In the room immediately after, you can find an audio log from the captain, which means it's time to explain exactly what's going on here. Many of the events of this game are centered around Dead Space's primary religion, Unitology. You learn much of what there is to know about this religion in the text log I mentioned earlier. It was a movement that started after a professor in anthropology, Michael Altman, blew the whistle on a government cover-up involving an artifact that was recovered on Earth that proved without a doubt that alien life exists. This artifact was a marker, and Altman was found dead shortly after, heavily implying that he was assassinated for going public with the information. I don't think that Altman's intention was to start an organized religion. I'm pretty sure that many of the more mystical things the church claims he said were fabrications and embellishments. The Unitologists believe that the marker contains the key to eternal life through rebirth and ascension to heaven. The only catch is that you need to die in order to achieve this. The article goes on to describe the structure of the church, how the average believers are considered initiates, and the inner workings, research, and experiments they perform are only revealed to the higher members. You achieve a higher status by giving money and power to the church, but all members are required to donate their bodies to it after death. There's an ongoing rumor that the church is building an entire fleet of ships, although the details are cut off at the end of this text log. dialogue. The writers of this series have been criticized for similarities between Unitology and our real-world Scientology, although they've stated that it isn't meant to represent any specific religion, only to show how a sect of humanity worships the markers and is willing to form a cult around them. This is actually really important to the greater lore, and I'll go into much more detail near the end of this video. The Ishimura wasn't just sent to Aegis 7 on a routine mining operation. You can find an audio log by one of the crew members outside the comms array where he says that everybody knew this job was illegal and they kept their mouths shut until the higher-ups refused to send out a distress signal when the outbreak began. The captain confirms this in his audio log but elaborates on the real reason they're here, the marker. Both the captain, the scientist, and all the leadership on the Ishimura were handpicked by the church to ensure they had full control over the operation. Dr. Kine is an expert on the original marker and was sent to try and decipher the one they found, and their goal was to share everything they found with the church so it could go public. No government cover-ups, only the truth. This log was recorded before they understood that removing the marker is what spurned the Necromorph outbreak on Aegis 7 and eventually the Ishimura itself, and everything that's happened here is their fault. You make your way to the shuttle and insert the nav cards that you collected, then go to test fire the engines. Once you do, Mr. Incredible arrives for another ass whooping. You defeat him this time by turning him into a nugget in front of the engines and then turning them on to burn it alive, which is why I took the time to share my thoughts whenever you cryogenically froze it before. This is a slightly predictable yet satisfying way to kill this thing that's been hounding you for 2 full levels. I like how the game resolves this issue. The first one keeps it in the back of your mind since you know that it could be unfrozen, and it is. You then kill it permanently and don't need to worry about it. I remember thinking to myself how the invincible enemy gimmick was something I really didn't want to see in the other 2 games, and considering what I just said, you can take a very solid guess at why I'm bringing this up now. Kine arrives and tells you that he'll be taking the shuttle to the flight deck while you go grab the marker from storage. You need to unlock the shuttle from the room you're in so you can fly it there, and you're basically forced to trust that he won't fly off with the shuttle himself. Kendra voices her own distrust for Kine, but says you need him on your side for now. She then tells you that she's going to make a run for the flight deck as soon as she gets a chance. Mercer contacts you one final time and you get to watch him as he lets the Necromorphs kill him so he can achieve everlasting life. I thought this meant he was going to bond with them to form some sort of super Necromorph like Mr. Incredible 2.0, but no, he just dies and you never see him again. Kine contacts you at the start of the next mission and tells you that he's at the flight deck and is awaiting your arrival with the marker. This was the mission where combat really started to drag for me, although it's not the worst example of it. I was ready to be done with the game now and started to see the fighting sections as more of a chore than anything else. You need to slowly drag the marker up this conveyor belt as more and more enemies spawn in, including the giant tentacles. You then load the marker onto the shuttle and watch as Kine's chest explodes when you try to board it with him. The shuttle takes off and you're contacted by Kendra as she reveals that she was the villain all along. She confirms that the USM Valor wasn't here by coincidence and tells you that the entire incident is one big government experiment. This marker isn't an alien artifact, it's man-made and was reverse engineered from the real one they found on Earth before Altman blew the whistle. The entire system around Aegis 7 was quarantined after the experiment ended in disaster, and the marker was buried for hundreds of years until the Ishimura arrived and dug it up. She was then sent to retrieve it and bring it back to Earth's government in one more attempt to cover up their mistakes. Things may start to make sense given this reveal, how she was constantly accusing Hammond of knowing something about the marker and pushing you not to trust him. She was the one jamming his comms, and those feedback spikes she was receiving were his attempts to contact you. It wasn't until the Valor crashed into the ship that he was able to get through, and his comms conveniently stopped working whenever he tells you that the Valor was prepped for war. It's clear that she was trying to get him killed the whole time. Nicole contacts you immediately after and tells you that she needs your help. She's in the flight control room, so you make your way there and speak with her. She tells you that she's sorry and that she never wanted to hurt you, then says that you need to get the marker back. You can pilot the shuttle remotely from the control room and recall it to the Ishimura. She then tells you to make us whole again, and Kendra uses an escape pod whenever you recall the shuttle. Nicole says that she can't escape her fate. None of us can. You then both take the shuttle down to Aegis 7 to return the marker and stop the hive mind. This starts the final mission, which I'll skip through most of because a majority of it isn't interesting. You arrive at the colony, which was overrun by Necromorphs prior to the outbreak on the Ishimura. You unload the marker from the shuttle and Nicole tells you to return it to the pedestal chamber. You step inside a building to find a battery and restore power to the complex, and whenever you return, Nicole is nowhere to be found. There are some Necromorphs in the area, and you're left to assume that she ran off when they arrived, although it's strange that she wouldn't radio in to tell you this. You then go through the involved and boring task of hauling the marker through this complex. It's mostly just a combat gauntlet with Nicole giving you the occasional instructions on how to proceed. Seeing as I was exhausted with the combat by this point, this level really dragged. Once you get the marker outside into the pedestal chamber, which I might add took me 20 minutes, you watch as it suppresses the hive mind and the Necromorphs die around you. Nicole then steps out from behind the marker and tells you that she knew you would return to her and that we are whole again. She then disappears in front of you, proving that she was never actually there, except it takes a bit longer for Isaac to realize this than it does for the player. A giant chunk of the planet that was being held in the sky starts falling back to the ground, so you get ready to put your grand escape plan in motion. As you step into a building, Kendra appears and takes the marker off its pedestal. She tells Isaac that he's gone insane and then urges him to rewatch the video of Nicole from the start of the game. You watch the video, seeing it to the end this time, and watch as Nicole commits suicide. The Nicole you've been seeing was a projection of the marker, using her as a motivation for Isaac to do what it wanted, just like how Kyne kept seeing Amelia. This is why she teleports around so much, speaks with cryptic phrases, and keeps repeating the phrase, "make us whole." There's also the great detail with the first letter of every mission spelling out Nicole is dead. The marker wanted you to return it to its pedestal for unknown reasons that will never really become clear later in the series. Even with the context of the later games, I've never been able to work out for myself why the marker would want to stop the Necromorphs. By removing it, Kendra has reanimated the Necromorphs and the hive mind itself. You're given one more chance to visit the shop or use a workbench before you proceed to the final boss. You watch as Kendra tries to get onto the shuttle before the hive mind bitch slaps her to death with its tentacle, then turns towards you. This cutscene can't be skipped and needs to be rewatched every time you attempt this boss, which set the standard for every unskippable cutscene for the rest of the franchise, even Dead Space 3. The hive mind is a great spectacle boss, but it's not very interesting from a gameplay perspective. We just watched as this thing killed Kendra with ease, and yet it can't land a single swipe against Isaac as he slowly walks, charging his contact beam. The fight gets interesting whenever it grabs you and you have to shoot it while upside down, but that's just another interesting part of the spectacle of this boss fight. The aiming is only slightly different than the other times you've been grabbed by the tentacle in this game. Enemies can also spawn in during this fight, although it only happened on my first attempt. It's possible they only do this whenever you run out of ammo, and since I hit the store to max out on my second try, they didn't need to spawn in, but it's still worth noting. It's unclear if you actually kill the hive mind here or if you just do enough damage to give you a chance to escape, but once it's defeated, you return to the shuttle and escape before the giant meteor smashes into the planet. You then watch as Isaac takes off his helmet and get to see his face for the first time. The recording of Nicole comes on one of the consoles, and Isaac hesitantly shuts it off. Then you see that he's still seeing hallucinations of Nicole even though the marker was seemingly destroyed. The credits roll, and that's the end of the game. I'm sorry if some of the story beats were boring to get through. They were definitely boring for me to recap, so you're not alone there. Dead Space is centered entirely around being a horror experience, and so the moment-to-moment gameplay doesn't have much in the way of interesting commentary. The story is told in a way that only video games can, with most of the plot details being trickle-fed between long stretches of gameplay and many of the finer details being found in optional logs scattered throughout the levels. It works well for a video game, and it's interesting to go through when you're experiencing it yourself, but receiving that secondhand doesn't really do it justice. Despite that, I want to make it clear that the story is told very well as you play the game, and it sets up the sequel near flawlessly. There's something very interesting about Dead Space's horror elements that I would like to touch on here. After all the interviews I've listened to regarding this franchise, it's very clear to me that cosmic horror wasn't a strong inspiration going in, but Dead Space manages to be one of the most Lovecraftian horror franchises that I've ever played, although not for obvious reasons. I don't have much first-hand knowledge when it comes to Lovecraft's work, but I'm still much more knowledgeable when it comes to the elements of cosmic horror. This doesn't make me an expert in the slightest, but I feel knowledgeable enough to have this discussion, and I'll try not to make any Lovecraft fans cringe too hard in this section. When I say Dead Space is Lovecraftian, I'm not referring only to tentacle monsters. As you're aware by now, those are definitely present, but contrary to public opinion, tentacles don't make something inherently Lovecraftian. The greatest elements of Lovecraft's work usually revolve around the frailty of man and the disastrous consequences from trying to understand the unknowable. Maybe this only leads to insanity, maybe it unleashes something far worse, but the threat is almost always existential. Dead Space has very similar themes in its own game, and the closer you look, the more comparisons can be drawn. The game has everything you'd expect from a stereotypical Lovecraftian video game. There's a plethora of monsters in this game, a cult that worships them, and enough tentacles to make a hentai artist blush. There are cosmic elements beyond our understanding, an existential threat in the Necromorphs, and a healthy dose of protagonist insanity to top it off. Dead Space has all the elements of a cosmic horror game, but it's the restraint and subtlety that makes these elements work. Everything about this game is wholly original, and as I mentioned earlier, it's highly likely the writers didn't even know they were tapping into these elements as they made the game. Glenn Schofield didn't even mention Lovecraft in that interview. He talked more about games like Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil 4. It's obvious by Dead Space 3 that they were fully committed to these concepts, but I still can't find a single source listing them as an inspiration. I'm going to elaborate on this much more after we discuss that game, but I want you to keep this in the back of your mind going forward. So, to wrap this section up, Dead Space is more of a horror experience than anything else, and it isn't a bad one. This isn't my favorite game in the series, but I can't deny that this is the most horror of the three, even if that side was ultimately lost on me. I can't deny the quality of this game even today, and even if you ignored the spoiler warning and got this far, I think this is a must-play for anybody who loves the horror franchise. I didn't comment on many of the smaller details and events that happened in gameplay, so there should be plenty of scares left to experience, even if you now know exactly what is going to happen. Dead Space is an amazing game, and its sequel is going to be much, much better. Dead Space 2 makes several improvements over the first game, although there's not much to talk about as far as differences are concerned. One of the biggest ones that everybody will notice is that Isaac is now a fully voiced character. This is a change I was hoping the games would make, and I'm very glad to see that they did. I'm also happy to hear that Gunnar Wright will be reprising his role as Isaac in the Dead Space remake, since I can't imagine anybody else voicing him at this time. EA Motive gets another point from me for this decision alone. Another good change is something more fundamental. Shooting now feels fluid and comfortable. You can now do basic things like switch weapons and reload while sprinting, and a new ability was added that allows you to pull the spiky bits off dead Necromorphs with telekinesis and shoot them back at enemies. This costs nothing and provides the player with a moderate damage attack to keep you in the fight longer and help conserve ammo, or allowing you to defend yourself when you've run out. You could always melee in the first game, but it was seldom reliable and meant you needed to get close, which could cause you to take more damage in the long run. In addition to this, stasis now recharges slowly over time, which is a small quality of life change that I didn't know I needed. This was never really a problem that needed to be fixed in the first game, but it is an improvement nonetheless. Now, let's talk about a few regressions. First, I don't like how the reticle is now a fixed PNG in the center of your screen. This can be changed in the settings, but I didn't know that on my first time through and kept whiffing shots because I couldn't see exactly where it was going to line up. In a game where the core combat involves precise shots on enemy limbs, I can't understand how this was seen as an improvement. It just feels like an unnecessary change to make the game feel more like other third-person shooters. This should be set to classic mode by default and let the players turn off the laser-based shooting if they don't like it, not the other way around. Another change I dislike involves drops from enemies. In the first game, you would only ever find loot for weapons that were in your inventory, and health packs seemed to only spawn whenever you were close to dead. Dead Space 2 started the trend that the third game would follow, with giving you so many health packs that you'll have a couple dozen in reserve, but this game also has the problem of dropping ammo for guns that you don't even own. This means that I would often hit the limit on my inventory because I have too many health packs and ammo for guns I'll never use, which is a problem I never had in the first game. The third game, quote, fixes this problem by only offering one universal ammo type, but Dead Space 2 was the beginning of the series' problems with inventory management. It's entirely likely that this isn't a problem on higher difficulties, but it was a problem for me when I played. I also had the issue of enemies being much tankier in this game and often shrugging off damage to hit me. You could usually stagger lock enemies with the pulse rifle in the first game, and this appears to have been changed in this one. This really wouldn't be a problem if enemy limbs didn't seem damn near indestructible on higher level enemies. This is an issue the first game had, but it wasn't as noticeable since the game was longer, so these enemies didn't start spawning as soon as they do in the second game. You can generally tell the difficulty of an enemy based on their color, so lighter skinned Necromorphs are weaker than the darker skinned ones, but they could almost always be reliably staggered in the first game, so they weren't as much of an issue. You could argue that this makes the Necromorphs more threatening since they're tougher now, but I never felt that way in this game, and I especially didn't feel it in the next one. This might be another personal issue though, I'm not sure. There are also some narrative changes. The story is now told in a linear way with more seamless transitions between chapters than just returning to the tram to go to a different area. This means that the map is no longer necessary, so it's been replaced with a more involved waypoint system. This not only shows you where to go next, it can be used to find things like workbenches or a store as well. And the linear structure of the levels means that the map from the first game is largely unnecessary. This also means I got lost far less often in this game than I did the first, even if that's only really an issue on your first playthrough. I think that the map was a neat tool, but I have to admit that I didn't use it near as much as I should have in the last game. However, I can totally see why some people would miss it. There are a couple of different changes from the first game that are better talked about during the story section, so I'd like to summarize this brief comparison by saying that Dead Space 2, despite its flaws, still feels and plays like a highly polished game, even for 2021 standards. The game doesn't just feel good for its time, it feels good, period, and I think that's largely because of this game's budget. You see, Dead Space 2 was a critical success and managed to sell about 4 million copies, but it also cost about $60 million to make and was considered a financial failure by EA. As a work of art, this game could hardly get any better, but critical acclaim hardly matters when profits don't meet expectations. It's easy to see that Visceral did everything they could to squeeze as much out of that budget as possible. Dead Space 2 feels like a game that was created as a piece of art first, and while it can't be considered a commercial failure, it clearly wasn't viewed as a success by EA. I think this is important to keep in mind as we go through this game and eventually get into Dead Space 3. With that said, and with my small number of criticisms out of the way, let's go ahead and get into it. Dead Space 2's story is the greatest contrast from the first game in almost every way. The biggest difference players will likely notice is that the game is much more cinematic than before. You always had control of Isaac in the first game. It was the reason that the tentacle scene almost killed the game. Glenn Schofield wasn't willing to compromise and take the player's control away by just showing a cutscene. This isn't true for the second game, and it was something that felt strange to me the first time I experienced it. I'd gotten so used to having full control in every scenario, so watching a cutscene felt out of place. Although I think it's for the better in this game's case. More work has gone into the presentation of this game, which resulted in these more cinematic moments that the developers were unwilling to put in the first one. The differences are greater than just that, however. There are also thematic differences. The Ishimura was a slaughter and a tragedy long before you arrived. It alluded to a crisis that you got to see the aftermath of, but Titan Station is one that you wake up to. You get to witness the outbreak firsthand and watch the station go dark as you play through it. It feels much more involved and personal, which is true to the rest of the game as well. It's no coincidence that Isaac is much more proactive in this game than he was in the first. He was content to mostly take orders and do the busy work in that game, but he takes the reins much more often in this one. That doesn't mean that he's fully in control though, because the Isaac of this game is firmly driven by guilt and is struggling to recover from the events of the first game. Not only is he still hallucinating and seeing that projection of Nicole, it's having a far worse effect on his psyche than it ever did before. This is shown to the player as early as the first scene of the game where you see a recording from when Nicole was on the Ishimura prior to the outbreak. You learn that Isaac was the one who pushed her to take the job on the ship and she was thanking him for doing so. The camera then zooms out and you see Isaac in a straitjacket. He's been checked into a mental institution and is being interrogated about what happened on the Ishimura. You learn that he volunteered for the repair mission as the doctor presses him to speak about the marker. A projection of Nicole then arrives to torment him. Welcome to Dead Space 2. Isaac has completely lost his mind. The next scene comes so quickly after that last one that you're likely to think that it's just another nightmare. You're awoken by a man who was sent to find you. He says that you're in terrible danger right before he's killed and turned into a necromorph by one of those bat-like infectors from the last game. You're immediately put into a chase sequence as this game spares no time getting you into the action. You're almost killed by some security guards whenever another necromorph in the vents takes them out before they have a chance to shoot you. The guards were given the order to purge the facility by somebody named Director Tideman. You're grabbed by one of the other patients who contemplates killing you before finally deciding to cut you out of your straitjacket and tells you to grab a health pack and a flashlight from the locker. He then says that they're all going to burn for what they did to you and slits his own throat. You're then contacted by someone named Dana, the same person that the man who found you was contacting before his death. She says you're suffering from a rare form of dementia that you contracted on Aegis 7, and she promises to treat you and get you to safety. You make your way forward, picking up a kinesis module along the way, and use the new Impale technique to fight off some necromorphs since you don't have a weapon yet. You then find a patient who is tied down to an operating table and Isaac tries to cut him loose. He decides to go for the plasma cutter instead of using his new Impale technique to kill the necromorph that wanders in, which results in the patient dying. In his defense, there's nothing to really impale it with in this room, and he's likely still waking up, but it still stuck out to me when I saw it. Another patient tells you to follow him, saying, "They're after us." You end up locked inside the hospital, but the other patient manages to escape. He tells you that he's Patient 5 and asks you to remember him. Isaac tells Dana that her route didn't work, and they fight for a moment before Isaac concludes that he doesn't need her help. He cools off after killing a few necromorphs and asks for her assistance. She tells him that she's not his enemy while acknowledging that they don't need to be friends, then sends him a new escape route. She also explains that you're on Titan, Saturn's largest moon, but doesn't have time to explain how an outbreak started before Tideman jams her signal. You do your first hacking minigame, something we'll be seeing a lot of for the rest of the series, and get access to a stasis module. This game demonstrates that it's willing to break consistency and logic for stupid reasons, because this necromorph can't be killed without using stasis and will kill you instantly if you don't. There's no reason that this should kill you instantly, it just does. You're then introduced to a new enemy that can shoot you with its own form of stasis that slows you down if it connects. After entering the elevator, Nicole comes back to haunt Isaac. This isn't the last time we'll be seeing moments like this, so I'll only be commenting on the ones that have any real plot relevance. You proceed forward and find a store where you can finally customize your loadout and put on one of the game's many badass suits. You proceed to the next room where you fight your first mini-boss, which is defeated by severing its arms to reveal its tentacle and cutting that off to kill it. Dana tells you that you were found by Tideman 3 years ago and were brought to this mental hospital to be studied. The marker from the first game imprinted your brain with a self-replicating signal that's actively killing you. Tideman tried to extend your life with memory suppressants, but Dana says that you need to hurry and reach her so she can cure you. For the sake of time, I'm going to speed up and only talk about the dialogue that is relevant to the greater plot. This game is shorter than the last one, but there's much more dialogue overall, so the discussion could easily be much longer. Dana tells you that Tiedemann created a new marker, which is where all the Necromorphs are coming from. His motivation, for now, seems to be power, and you're told to proceed to the tram station. You make it there and are forced to jump across a gap between two of the cars, which starts your first fast flying section. This is similar to other linear flying sections that involve you dodging obstacles seen in many other games. You fight off some Necromorphs until the tram crashes and leaves you hanging upside down. You need to defend yourself while stuck hanging there, and I was convinced that this was a reference to The Last of Us until I realized that this game predates it. Isaac cuts himself down and avoids getting crushed by the tram before proceeding forward, and I say Isaac does it because it happens in a cutscene that you have no control over. Dana tells you to make your way to the Cassini Towers residential sector, so you set off in that direction. You're then introduced to the first infected first grader Necromorphs that the game frequently uses as fodder, and I'm sure this was supposed to be a frantic moment in gameplay, but I heard the Doom music kick in and couldn't stop laughing as I bitch slapped the entire horde to death. It was quite possibly the funniest moment in this entire game to me. You enter your first zero-gravity chamber shortly after, and you'll see that you have actual thrusters to fly around with instead of the awkward jumping from wall to wall that was seen in the first game. You travel through a garbage chute and end up in the Church of Unitology, where Isaac has another vision of Nicole. He tells both her and himself that she isn't real, and the vision ends. It's obvious that he's trying to fight the marker's influence, but it shows how badly his mental state is deteriorating. The Church of Unitology is both beautiful and disturbing, and it shows more than anything how badly the last game needed some variety in its environments. The architecture is almost alien, which makes sense given what they stand for, but puts off an unsettling atmosphere at the same time, especially if you played the first game and know what the Unitologists are capable of. Dana says this is one of the few places where Tiedemann can't eavesdrop on them due to the separation of church and state, and Isaac makes it clear that he doesn't think they should be here. She tells you to meet her at a safe room at the top of the church. After exiting a maintenance vent, which is one of the new ways the game lets you get around, Isaac is immediately attacked by Nicole as she tries to stab him in the eye with a needle. It's shown after the vision passes that Isaac is the one holding it and he was struggling only with himself. I love the contrast between this vision and the last one, and the oh shit moment as you realize that Isaac's ability to reject these influences is far more fragile than you had realized. You're then put in a dark room with the other new enemy type that stalks you before eventually charging head on and knocking you down. I find these enemies extremely annoying since they don't stagger as easily as the other ones. Stasis is effective, but I found the pulse rifle's grenade launcher to be the best way of dealing with them. At best, you'll be bored of all the downtime between charges, and at worst, these things will kill you before you have a chance to kill them. Dana lets it slip while Tiedemann starts jamming her again that he's working for Earth's government, simply called EarthGov. This is a small detail that adds quite a bit of context going forward. You make your way through the funerary wing, home to one of the few jump scares that actually caught me off guard, and then proceed forward until you loop back to the main church and once again get mentally assaulted by Nicole. You then head into the elevator and rendezvous with Dana, where you're grabbed by some guards. You see, Dana is a unitologist, and she lied about the cure so you wouldn't question her about things, which is cleverly reinforced by how dire the last couple of visions have been. It's likely that even you, the player, weren't questioning her as much as you should have been because you saw how badly Isaac needed the cure she was promising. She says that EarthGov won't leave you alone because they're afraid you'll destroy their marker, and she also says that you're the one who built it. She brought you here so you can build more of them, and she references something called the Convergence. She orders the guards to take you away and put you in stasis, and you're saved when one of Tiedemann's gunships kills Dana and gives you a moment to escape. This doesn't mean Tiedemann is on your side though, the gunship still tries to kill you too. You're then attacked by a larger Necromorph and put in a glorified QuickTime event where you shoot its glowing bits and run away, and are dragged into space when a gunship arrives and blows out the windows. Both of you and the monster latch onto the gunship, and you get away by blowing up one of the ship's fuel tanks and come flying back into the station. You're then contacted by Patient 5, who Dana told you earlier is named Strauss. She warns you that he's a psychopath who murdered his wife and child, although you're unlikely to believe anything she told you by this point. Strauss tells you that you both built the marker and you can tear it down. He says it's in the government sector and urges you to hurry, saying that time is running out for both of you. You can tell in conversations with Strauss that he's hallucinating just like you, except he doesn't realize that what he's seeing isn't real. You then proceed forward and solve a puzzle where you put out a fire by shutting off oxygen support in the room, and you move forward to meet our next character, Ellie. She proves not to be the most trusting person as she threatens to shoot you if you get any closer and tells you that the last person who told her he wants to help tried to kill her. Isaac eventually gets a chance to talk to her and says he's trying to get to the government sector, and she says she's trying to do the same. Isaac offers to help her, and she says that other people are just a liability and that she'll release the door lock only after she's gone. Then she politely asks you not to follow her. You then make your way through an elementary school and watch as a woman hugs an infected infant that explodes and splatters her all over the room. Because Dead Space 2 has balls of steel and gives no fucks about trying to be subtle with its disturbing content. This is one of the most memorable moments in the game. The playful voice in the automated system telling the kids to play nice during their 15 minutes of recess is juxtaposed with the explosive babies that are crawling out of the wall. You make it to the gymnasium, and the game shows that even Isaac is on edge as he encounters the greatest jump scare in the entire series. You clear the stage by hacking another junction box and get a brief moment of silence before you're swarmed by the screaming first graders and exploding infants. This was the moment I looked around at the carnage and thought, Jesus, I've killed a lot of kids in this game. I wonder if YouTube's gonna flag me for saying that. The elementary school shows just how far the developers were willing to push what's considered acceptable in a game, and it's very memorable. The various text logs of the teachers detailing how the kids all have imaginary friends of their dead relatives hit you in a way that other games aren't willing to, as you realize that the marker's presence was having an impact on the kids. And I'm legitimately shocked that a publisher like EA would let something like this be released. You're confronted by Nicole again as she taunts Isaac and ridicules him for insisting that she's just a hallucination. You're then contacted by Ellie immediately after to see that she has Strauss at gunpoint. Isaac convinces her not to kill him, but she says that she will if he tries anything stupid. You then meet her outside and she says that she was with the CEC, the same organization that Isaac worked for in the first game. They were the ones who sent the repair team to the Ishimura. Tideman cuts the power to the facility and then contacts you directly. He says that the train is inoperable, and Isaac accuses him of being insane for cutting life support to a building where there are other survivors. Tideman says that the public sector is already beyond recovery conditions and that he can't allow you to escape. You then fight one of the Juggernaut Necromorphs, which now have weak points on its shoulders so you can sever the limbs. Isaac fills Ellie in on the situation and tells her that he and Strauss are going to try and destroy the marker. Ellie agrees to help, mostly because you're all about to die if she doesn't, and you set out to repair some solar panels and get the backup power online so you can restore life support to the facility. You take an elevator to the top of the facility and do a simple puzzle that took me entirely too long to figure out. You don't have the clearance for this area, so you drag the operator's dead body to the scanner with telekinesis to get through. There's a store right next to the scanner, and I thought I needed to put on a special suit to give me access. Once you're in, the facility AI will start activating security measures like tripwires that you need to get through. Tideman eventually realizes what you're trying to do and has it lock down the area. You use some vents to get to the nearby rooms and solve some puzzles to reveal the mainframe's power nodes, which you then destroy to shut off the AI and lift the lockdown. You then realign the solar panels, and Ellie tells you that some Necromorphs are heading for the transport hub and are wrecking everything in their path. You need to get down there before they cut you off, so you launch yourself back down to the tower and do 5 minutes of backtracking in about 20 seconds. You still weren't fast enough, and Ellie hacks a door to a factory so you can escape the wave of Necromorphs. Ellie tells you how she was in the same place this morning. She was with a crew with 30 people who were overrun, and she needed to dismember her colleagues in order to escape. Needless to say, she's not happy to be back. You can find audio logs throughout this area that gives a little more detail about her situation and how she became the sole survivor. She then shuts down the processing plant so you can find a way around to them, and Tideman turns it back on to try and kill you. You loop around and meet with the gang where you see Strauss is in terrible shape. You could hear in almost every conversation with Ellie leading up to this that he's becoming more and more delusional. He tells you that, after all the screws, after the needle, she'll be waiting. It's unclear what he means by this, and he's in no condition to elaborate. Ellie tells you about a service transport that can take you to the government sector, so you set out to repair the line. Nicole continues to torment Isaac by telling him that he pushed her away when he told her to take the job on the Ishimura, and he knew she was dead when he decided to go looking for her, saying that he didn't even have the stomach to watch the recording from the first game to its conclusion. She then appears directly again, asking Isaac why he went looking for her if he knew she was dead. As you're taking the transport, you see that the Ishimura was brought to Titan Station. Ellie says that she heard everybody on board died of a terrorist attack, and Isaac tells her that everything that's happening here happened on the Ishimura, but he's interrupted when the transport suddenly stops. Something is blocking the tracks. Get out, fight some enemies, blow up some tanks, and barely escape before you're incinerated in the process. Tideman contacts you and tells you you're being a big dummy head and uses a solar beam to cut the tracks in half. Isaac then has the idea of using the Ishimura's gravity tethers to quite literally pull the government sector towards you and align the tracks. This next part was the biggest surprise to me, and it's the greatest moment in the entire series. You're not just going back to the Ishimura and exploring some random part of the ship you didn't see in the first game. This is a full recreation of the environments from the first game. I cannot express enough just how great this next sequence is. After so many hours of backtracking over the Ishimura in the first game, the environments felt immediately familiar, but not so copy-pasted as to appear lazy by the developers. Nicole has a great line in this area where she points out all the plastic that's been put up by the recovery team to try and hide the bloodbath that happened here, and she's both calling out Isaac and the player by saying that you remember what truly happened. The first leg through the Ishimura is mostly original, or at least I can't pinpoint where exactly it lies on the ship. This changes the moment you take a lift up to the tram line and see the similarities, and it only grows from here. Lockers, stores, workbenches, and save stations are in the exact same spot they were in the last game, and while the ship is visually different, the layout is immediately familiar. There are new audio logs to find from the research team where you learn that the Necromorphs devolve into a bloody sludge-like material until they're reanimated by a marker signal. The game throws in a scare by having a Necromorph jump you right after using a save station, and if you hadn't noticed the similarities before, the centrifuge looking exactly the same as the first game with a new puzzle to solve solidifies that this is the same ship as before. Then, you step outside and get grabbed by a tentacle, just like before. This is shown to be a flashback, but everything about the grab animation is identical. Strauss eventually loses it while you're aboard the ship, and he attacks Ellie with a screwdriver, saying that the needle will make her see. It's unclear what becomes of them, and you're far from done on the Ishimura. In addition to engineering, you need to go through the medical deck and the bridge. Ellie radios in and you learn that she's alive, and you proceed through the ship. The medical deck is likely where you spent the most amount of time in the first game due to the numerous backtracks, and it's covered in UV light. This is where the game impressed me the most, as little things like moving this platform over with telekinesis carried over from the previous game, and I could see the blood spot from where one of the insane crew members cracked his head open against the wall. I can't stress enough how this really is a faithful recreation of the ship with an obscene level of attention to detail. You eventually make it to the bridge and activate the gravity tethers, then tell Ellie to go ahead while you take an escape pod to the government sector. Strauss once again attacks Ellie with a screwdriver again, except this time he stabs her eye out with it. You eventually catch up with them, albeit on the other side of a gate, and Ellie attacks him with a pipe. The door then shuts and you can't see what happens next. She tells you that he ran off deeper into the mines, and Isaac tells her to get somewhere safe. Strauss grabs you after you hotwire another door and tries to stab your eye out. Isaac is forced to kill him, and you proceed to get mentally assaulted by Nicole again. She's been asking Isaac, "Who am I?" for the last couple encounters, and she says that this is the last time she's asking before the end. You ride an elevator up, and she grabs you at the next door. She asks him, rather cryptically, whether she's a projection of Nicole as he remembers her, or she's a projection of his guilt and his inability to save her. She then asks why he can't let go, and he tells her that if he lets her go, then he has nothing left. This causes her to physically change to look less demonic, and she reveals what the whole point of this torment was, finding acceptance with what happened. This probably sounds a little cartoonish with the way I just described it, but it's fine when you're playing the game and experience it yourself. These were basically projections of his guilt manifesting in Nicole's image, and it was something that Strauss was suffering from as well that pushed him to attack Ellie. Isaac was able to find acceptance, whereas Strauss was not. Isaac tells Ellie that Strauss is dead, and they repair a giant drill to mine your way to the government sector. You make it there, crashing the drill in the process, and Ellie tells you that there's a gunship docked nearby. She suggests you take it to escape the station, and Isaac says that he's going to stay behind. She brushes this off and tells him to get over there so you can both escape. Once you arrive, Isaac launches the gunship to save Ellie as she pleads with him to come with her. He tells her that he wasn't able to save Nicole, but he is able to save her, and it's something that he needs to do. Nicole then arrives, much calmer than she was before, and Isaac starts talking about how he's still not able to let her go. She tells Isaac to touch her, which he refuses, likely because he knows she's still a hallucination and doesn't want to shatter the illusion. Tideman then tells you that he has 200 armed guards in his bunker and that you're as good as dead if you get in. You hack the door so you can enter the bunker and are cut off by a barricade of guards. You run into a nearby bathroom to avoid getting shot to death, and they somehow lose you despite there only being one way you could have gone. You then kill the power to the room, which weakens the shielding on the front door long enough for the Necromorphs to break through and overrun the barricade. Tideman calls you an idiot and says that the Necromorphs can't reach the marker and orders his men to fall back. This brings us to the final gauntlet of the game as you fight through this newly infested compound. You can also find some research logs about the markers themselves. Smart people are able to see codes and blueprints while others are subject to dementia. This is how Isaac was able to build the marker in the first place. He was just following the blueprints. You make it to the marker chamber and see that it's much larger than the one from the first game. The Necromorphs appear to be worshipping it, and Nicole says convergence is at hand. Tideman contacts you to inform you that you done fucked up, and they were almost at the point of understanding the marker. He confirms the Necromorphs are triggering a convergence event, and you watch as they all start floating towards the sky. You proceed to the next room where you find a machine that Strauss had mentioned. Isaac says this activates the part of your brain where the marker codes are stored, and you retrieve them by sticking a needle in your eye. This explains why both Kine and Mercer repeatedly did this to their victims in the last game, although they were clearly a little too forceful with it, likely because they were going insane. This is either the most subtle retcon I've ever seen in a video game, or the writers took a small scene to build on so that there could be something that ties back. Regardless, I'm still not sure if this was planned from the start or if it was a happy accident by the end. Nicole says that the marker is afraid of both of you working together, and you get a minigame where you need to stick a needle in Isaac's eye. Going too fast will cause his heart rate to increase, and you will fail if you don't stick it into his pupil directly. Isaac, like anybody in this situation, doesn't hold his eyes still, and the scene that plays if you fail is brutal. Mr. Incredible shows up to play, although you may not realize it's him since his model has changed, and I wasted too much ammo trying to kill him before I realized I couldn't. This is one of the more tense moments as you need to hotwire a door while it's still alive, but this puts you directly into the most difficult part of the game. I ran out of both ammo and health packs in this section, and I still needed to get through a zero-gravity combat sequence with environmental hazards that can kill you instantly, and a special enemy that shoots homing space jellyfish at you. I ended up using the Kinesis Impale to kill it, but this almost made me quit the game. There's a store right after this point so you can stock up before continuing. Nicole tells you to meet her at the marker, and you can find one final text lock where Tiedemann explains what the research is about. Earth is facing a resource crisis, and the markers are a source of unlimited energy. You make it to the marker where Tiedemann attacks you with a harpoon gun. You're immediately put into a QuickTime event to save your life, and I hope the prompt is as difficult for you to see as it was for me when I died here. Tiedemann is half scorched by something, probably the marker itself, and you take his harpoon gun and kill him with it. Isaac then embraces Nicole in front of the marker, and she tells you that it's time to die. As you've probably figured out by this point, this wasn't a projection of Isaac's guilt or his acceptance for Nicole's death, it was the marker the entire time. The game subtly hints at this as Nicole asks Isaac to make them whole back when you saved Ellie, which could be waved away as a callback to the first game when it actually wasn't. She uses this physical contact to try and take control of Isaac's mind, which is why she asked him to touch her. It's foreshadowing disguised as a tender scene with Isaac's dead girlfriend. The marker led you here specifically to trigger the conversions, but the body of the one who made the marker is needed to complete it. This puts you in a boss fight that involves you shooting Nicole until the marker reveals itself, then shooting the marker itself, all while shadowy first graders swarm you. This fight is annoying because Nicole can teleport directly in front of wherever you're walking, and so much as touching her is enough to lose this fight. Once you destroy the marker in your mind, you wake up to see that it was destroyed in real life too, and Isaac sits down as the facility begins to fall apart. The credits begin to roll, implying this is where he dies, but they're interrupted when Ellie contacts you and says that she's crashing through the ceiling to rescue you. You then enter the gunship as the facility explodes and fly off to safety. You can see in the ending cutscene the designers forgot about Isaac's eye being stabbed out, since it's not bloodshot or bleeding, and you watch as Isaac looks over at Ellie with some distracting visual tearing on the screen. Or maybe that was just me. The credits roll for real this time, and I have to say that I appreciate the fake out. As you can tell, Dead Space 2's story is much more involved than the first games. There's more dialogue overall, and much of it helps flesh out Isaac's character. I didn't take much time to talk about it, but the moments where Isaac tries to come to terms with Nicole's death are very powerful, and they serve the ending well when he realizes that she was never actually there, it was just the marker. On paper, this sounds like they just copied and pasted the plot from the first game, but hopefully you can see that it is much more than just a lazy rehash. Isaac starts off believing Nicole isn't actually there, but then slowly comes to realize that these hallucinations might be a part of her, before he's once again hit with the cold realization that it was just a fantasy. He fell for the same trick twice. Still, Isaac redeems himself in many ways over the course of the game, and much of it involves this internal struggle. I think Dead Space 2 has the greatest story out of all three games with some of the series' greatest moments, but it doesn't add the most interesting pieces of lore. That would come in the third game. You've probably noticed that I haven't had many criticisms for the last two games. Most of my gripes have been about some annoying mechanics in the off-story discussion, but I haven't had near as much to say as I have with other games I've covered. That's because these two games are mostly fine. I wouldn't consider them perfect, but they are highly polished experiences that don't have as many flaws as we probably come to expect with AAA titles. This is all about to change, because Dead Space 3 is an absolute disaster, in almost every way. I'd like to state now that I won't be talking about the microtransactions in this game. I know that they were a big deal at the time, but decisions like these are almost always made by the publisher to increase revenue and not really the developer's decision. In fact, many sources I've found confirm that the dev team wasn't behind their inclusion. You have to navigate to an entirely different menu outside of the game just to access them, and I'm not going to be yet another person to inflate this topic as if it's the sole reason that this game is bad. In fact, Ben Wannett, the senior creative director at Sledgehammer who worked at the game when he was still with Visceral, confirmed himself that they were mandated by EA's marketing team to reach a certain revenue margin. It's good that EA got this much backlash about the subject, but it's been 8 years and the situation has only gotten much worse since then. That's all I'm really going to say about this subject. They're in the game, and I'll be focusing on the story and gameplay when judging it. And my god, is there a lot for me to judge here. In fact, there's so much to judge that it's like a Toys R Us for nitpicky assholes like me. I'll give Dead Space 3 one thing. It definitely tries its hardest to be something unique and introduces some of my favorite concepts to the lore, but it's not enough to make up for how much this game fails in other areas. The biggest criticism I can lay on this game is just how much of your time it wastes with things that don't actually matter. Many of these are easy to forgive because they're hiding load zones. Using kinesis to open a door takes an extra few seconds of your time and can get annoying after a while, like the game feel equivalent of stretching out your sentence to meet a word count on a paper, but it exists to kill time so the game can load the next room. The same can be said about things like waiting for an airlock to pressurize or for an elevator to arrive before you can step inside. The second one can be pretty awkward because even if you call the elevator and don't use it, you still have to wait whenever the door shuts again, even though it should already be on your floor. I don't think this is the reason that climbing ladders is so slow, but it might be related. There are way too many ladders in the first half of the game regardless, and some of them feel like they're short enough to be replaced with stairs instead. Regardless, these have a technical purpose to them and are necessary for the game to run optimally. The same can't be said about some of the other time wasters, like how using a workbench takes seemingly twice as long as it needs to given everything you have to sit through. You have to watch the animation as the bench boots up, upgrade your weapon, then sit through an animation that shows Isaac modifying it before you're allowed to progress. This means that if you're unfortunate enough to change your mind on something you just did, you'll have to watch the animation again after making another change. You have to watch every UI boot up for all the minigames, fast travel ships, and suit kiosks. You even have to watch the animation where you drop the scavenger bot every time you use it. This is selected with the scroll wheel, which is the same way you cycle through weapons, so there were several moments where I would accidentally pull out my scavenger bot and place it in the middle of a fight, which starts this unskippable animation that usually resulted in me taking damage. This means that I tried to drop them at every given opportunity until I finally learned to take a pause and make sure I actually had my gun out before I started shooting. I also don't understand why you can't stop using telekinesis just by pressing the button it's bound to anymore. There are going to be times that you want to quickly drop something and start shooting, but now you need to cancel it by either throwing what you're holding or stop aiming to drop it and then immediately start aiming again in order to shoot it. This wasn't a problem in the previous games, and I don't really know why this was changed. I can't stress enough how much this game feels like it doesn't respect the player's time. It's one of the biggest gripes I have with it. Moving on, let's talk about some changes that were made to the game's formula. First, you now have access to a basic dodge roll and a crouch, the latter which is only really used with combat against human enemies. This was something I was hoping we would get to see when we entered the bunker in Dead Space 2, but it was actually this game where it would be implemented. The dodge roll doesn't give you invincibility frames, which means that it's basically useless outside of the occasional boss encounter, and it's pretty much useless there too. Combat against human enemies brings some slight depth that isn't seen with Necromorphs, like using telekinesis to throw grenades back at enemies, but these encounters aren't very frequent, so this is kind of a waste of a mechanic. Still, it's pretty cool to pull off. In addition to this, you're now limited to 2 weapons instead of 4, and there is one universal ammo type that covers all of them. I don't mind the single ammo type, but limiting the player to 2 weapons hurts the game far more than it helps it for reasons we'll get into later. There are many more flaws with the game's combat divorced from the other elements of the game. For starters, enemies are much tankier, almost never stagger, and are far, far faster than they ever were in the previous games. I think the basic Necromorphs move nearly as fast as the special super speeders from the first game, which makes fighting them an absolute chore. This doesn't pair well with your limited arsenal, which means you can't carry as many power weapons as you could in the previous games. The standard loadout I had in the first 2 games were the plasma cutter and pulse rifle for light weapons with cheaper ammo, and the contact beam and line gun for some slower, harder hitting weapons that were more costly to use. Being limited to 2 weapons means my total damage output has been effectively cut in half. Those of you who've played the game are probably thinking you can carry 4 weapons, you just need to craft them. And you're not entirely wrong. Dead Space 3 features a fairly in-depth crafting system that allows you to mix and match almost any weapon combination that gives you quite a bit of freedom to play around with. This is why there's one universal ammo type, because switching a flamethrower with a buzzsaw in the field wouldn't be possible otherwise. You build these weapons by scavenging materials around the various locations you visit that don't take up space in your inventory. Mostly. Weapon components still take up an inventory slot for some reason, which was increasingly frustrating as I was constantly stopping and dropping one of my 5,000 health packs to make space for them. This issue is strange because there's already a solution with crafting materials getting their own infinite slot in your inventory, so I don't see why weapon components couldn't either. They stack infinitely once you get them to a bench anyways, so what's the purpose of this? The inclusion of this crafting system means that, if I wanted to, I could craft a line gun and a contact beam as one weapon with a pulse rifle and something else on the other. There are some limitations to this though. For starters, weapons are separated between one-handed and two-handed, with two-handed weapons getting a majority of the options but also limiting you from weapons that fall under the other category. This means that I can't make a pulse rifle and plasma cutter since they're not compatible, even though a one-handed weapon should theoretically work when attached to the fore of a two-handed weapon. I mean, that's literally how single-shot grenade launchers work in real life. However, there's one reason that crafting doesn't solve this problem for me. Weapons already had an alternate firing mode in the previous games. The contact beam had both a charge shot and a quicker AoE blast that could be used instantly. The pulse rifle had a rapid fire AoE in the first game and a grenade launcher in the second. The line gun could shoot mines that would cut everything in a small range around them, and the plasma cutter could switch the angle of the shot, something it can still do in this game but takes up your secondary weapon slot. This means you had a maximum of 8 methods of attack in the previous games, whereas you have a maximum of 4 in this one. This is made even worse when you consider that enemy health bars are so bloated now. You're going to want a good variety of AoE and single target damage in this game, since cutting off individual limbs is so taxing now, and the game won't shy away from throwing enemies at you in droves. What we have is a combat system that feels unsatisfying with bullet sponges around every corner, and the experience certainly doesn't feel very balanced. This means the game has the potential to drag, and it certainly did for me, but something I can't deny is that a more action-focused experience could work for the series if the numbers were tuned properly. I think the Dead Space remake is going to take a step back and build a stronger foundation that the series will hopefully build on going forward. I'd even be happy if they were to do a Dead Space 3 remake before moving on to Dead Space 4, but only time will tell what happens to the franchise in the future. Of course, if there ever was a remake of this game, there would be the awkward task of trying to fix the co-op mechanics. I'd like to add some context to Visceral's situation with Dead Space 3 before I unload all my criticism onto it, because co-op was never intended to be in the game. Eurogamer contributor Chris Bratt did an interview with Ben Wannett where he gives some insight on what happened behind the scenes during this game's development. He mentions on at least 2 occasions that the decision to add multiplayer was made by the executives, not the studio itself. They were in a similar situation with the microtransactions, and Ben confirms that the crafting system was never designed to encourage people to spend money on them. Despite being essentially forced to create a co-op, the team still did their best to make it work with the game's atmosphere and systems. They had some truly great ideas that I'll be going into when discussing the characters and story, but it's only fair to point out that this wasn't a feature that was planned from the start. It was added about halfway through development. However, despite the fact that co-op was never intended, I can't deny the sheer number of problems it has. Every issue I've brought up so far is amplified by it. There is now an additional time waster as things now require both players to interact with before you can proceed. This makes sense for those not so cleverly hidden loading doors, but some things require 2 players when there's no reason to. The best example are the forced cooperation moments in the game that simply don't exist in the single player mode. One of them is seen relatively early on where the player is forced to hold something down with kinesis while the other turns the knob. This doesn't make the puzzle more interesting, it just makes it more cumbersome. There's also the issue like requiring both players to interact with a stash at the end of a side mission to open it. This isn't a 2-man job, just let us open the damn box and move on with our lives. The game is absolutely full of moments like this, and I'm going to indulge myself by commenting on every single one I come across when going through the story. There are many more issues co-op brings than just this. Enemies are now buffed to compensate for the extra firepower, but they were already too spongy in the single player mode, so all this really does is make combat feel even less satisfying than before. Watching a single enemy take 4 or 5 rockets to die on easy mode isn't enjoyable and is more than a little immersion breaking, and it goes to show just how bloated the game's combat comes across as. I would have preferred more enemies to tougher enemies, and it doesn't help that I was already sick of this game's combat by the time I started a co-op playthrough with my friend. And these are only a handful of problems that the co-op has in gameplay. I haven't even started on the issues that it brings to the story. You see, co-op was a double-edged sword that managed to impale the single-player mode with its inclusion, and it's become hard to tell which experience was intended to be the true one. Very little is changed between these modes, including the myriad of problems that plague the main story. Almost all of these relate to the co-op character, Carver. Regardless of whether you're playing single-player or co-op, some scenes with this character will never make any sense. The best example, ironically, is the one that doesn't involve him, the prologue. There are 2 variations of this depending on the mode you're playing through. The single-player mode only features one throwaway character, but the co-op adds another one for the other player. Dialogue is different depending on what you do, but the end result is always the same. You grab the item you were looking for and fall down this cliffside while trying not to get crushed by the wrecked ship that follows you. Once you do, the same cinematic plays that shows this general execute player 1. On co-op, the second character just vanishes. It's implied that it gets swept away in this avalanche, but it's still strange that they just disappear. The reason this happens is because having an extra person here would have changed the outcome of these events. He could have retaliated against the general for shooting his friend, and if that happened, then the data on the device wouldn't be deleted, which means that the entire story from the previous 2 games wouldn't have happened since this takes place in the past. The easiest solution is to make this character die, but the game doesn't make it clear enough that they were killed. This is relatively tame compared to what Carver does in this game, but it still addresses the core problem. Because the plot needs to progress in a specific way, some scenes end up feeling forced as a result. Carver will warp in and out of existence whenever the story demands it, or the invisible forces that made Isaac a silent protagonist in the first game will temporarily possess him and he won't speak up when he should, all because the scene was made without consideration to him being there. There's this awkward tug-of-war between these game modes, and whichever side gains the most ground for that moment causes problems for the other one. Some moments in co-op feel like they were created for single players, so Carver's role is minimal. Some moments in single player feel like they're lacking context that's provided in the co-op, so lines of dialogue don't make any sense. This isn't even mentioning the fact that cutscenes will cut to Isaac's perspective when you're playing as Carver, making the few that don't do this a pleasant surprise. What frustrates me about this is that the original concept for Carver's character would have fixed these issues. Ben mentioned in that interview with Eurogamer that Carver was initially envisioned to be Isaac's alter ego, and it was going to be revealed at the game's climax that he didn't actually exist. This was going to be another way of showing how fractured Isaac's mind was, and this awkwardness could have been used to reinforce this twist instead of coming off as intermittent plot holes. To better reinforce this point, all you have to do is imagine that Nicole in the first game was actually alive with no other changes to how the game plays out, and you see how many problems that causes for the story. This decision was likely cut when the team decided to drop the marker dementia concept that was seen in the previous two games, and I think the story is worse off because of it. This is something I think Ben is aware of given how he brings up this issue while describing this concept.
We only just scratched the surface on it because, like I said, dementia was sort of given the, like, don't really go into the dementia thing. True. Which is it's my favorite part of the series, so it's a little hard to stay away from it, but that's how we would have manifested it, and ultimately we would have tried to build it into the climax of the game. The trick is that you have to make it so that it would work for a single-player game as well, play through. But I think that would have been easier to solve than the conveniently not there Carver, that was like, hey, I'm standing in the background of the scene. It's expensive to do, and hey, I'm not in this scene because that's the ultimate cheap thing to do.
It's hard for me to properly explain this dichotomy between the two modes. You can't address the problems with one without creating more problems in the other, and so they end up remaining mutually broken. I think this problem will become more apparent as we go through the story, and I begin pointing out many of the differences between the two. It's not all bad though. There are some unique perspective moments that make the game more interesting. Carver will occasionally hallucinate and see things that Isaac can't see, and Isaac will sometimes receive messages that Carver can't hear. A good example is whenever one of the characters calls Isaac on a private channel to confront him about a personal issue. Carver isn't able to hear this conversation since it was private, and while it may seem weird that he can't hear Isaac talking despite being right next to him, it does make sense. There are also unique cutscenes between the modes that do try to add context to what's going on, even if they feel too scarce to really make up for the number of issues it has. Something to take away from this is that the developers tried to do something interesting instead of just tacking on another person to an otherwise single-player experience. Good intentions only get you so far when it comes to judging something like this, but trying something interesting and failing is still better than lazily implementing something and taking no risks at all. Unfortunately for this game, that's the most amount of praise I can give it. These occasional perspective shifts don't ever lead to anything interesting, and there are far more problems with this story that are divorced from Carver's short-range teleportation abilities. The plot itself struggles with some questionable decisions that are much harder to defend, or even justify. I attempted 2 playthroughs of this game. The first was on single-player mode. I then went back and played it again with my friend Alex on co-op, but we didn't finish that run, which is why I said I attempted 2 playthroughs. We quit for a number of reasons, one of them being that we simply weren't having fun. But the biggest motivation killer for me was that I lost about 2 hours of footage when a power surge shut off my PC during a severe thunderstorm in my area. We had just cleared the buggiest part of the game and I got some good footage of him dying to empty air, and I lost it all in a literal flash. For those of you rightfully wondering why I was recording during a thunderstorm, that was the only day off we both had that week, and we were trying to force our way through the rest of the game in one fell swoop. We ended up recording the final co-op side quest and ending things there. This means that I won't be going through the comparisons for the final act of the game, but we will have enough context about Carver's background for some things to make sense. With all that said, I think it's time we get into it. Let's go through the prologue again, but in more detail this time. If you're playing single player, then you'll get a quick recap of the last 2 games so you can understand what's going on. If you're on co-op, then this is skipped, which left Alex very confused. Just like many other parts of this game, I don't understand why this change was made. You play as two forgettable goons whose names are unimportant, which is why I don't remember them. Player 1 contacts somebody named Dr. Serrano who tells you to follow the waypoint he sent or all is lost. You make it to a crashed ship where you fight some new Necromorph enemies that are still mostly human. You're then introduced to two of the most annoying features in this game back to back as if it's just a sick joke. You climb a ladder and then do one of those two-person interactions that I said I was going to point out at every opportunity. I, being player 2, picked up the cylinder Serrano sent us to retrieve, and player 1 proceeds to pick it up in the cutscene. Yes, this was important enough for me to remark on. We're setting the stage for what's to come. You then go through your first downward rappelling section that transitions into a slide down this mountain, then player 2 gets sent into the Shadow Realm and is never seen again. Player 1 lands somewhere else and is surrounded by dead bodies. He's then met by General, totally not a villain, Mahad, who shoots him in the head and deletes the information off the cylinder, which Serrano had referred to as the Codex. He then commits suicide, which makes you wonder why he felt the need to fuck over the rest of the universe in the process. This introduction will make sense later, but I still can't help but find the sequence really stupid no matter how much the game explains it. You then cut to a colony on the moon, where Isaac is now living. You see that he and Ellie had a failed relationship and he's taken the breakup rather poorly. The door to his apartment opens, which causes Isaac to draw his weapon, and Carver demonstrates his teleportation abilities right off the bat by appearing in his room before the door opened. He detains Isaac just as another man enters the room. He tells you that he's looking for you because you know how to destroy the markers and says that he has a job for you, to which Isaac immediately refuses. Once he learns that Ellie was involved in the mission and that they lost contact with her, and when he sees the unitologists are tearing the city apart looking for him, he changes his mind and decides to go along with it. You learn who these people are, Captain Norton and Sergeant Carver, which he describes as EarthGov's last battalion. Seeing as the unitologists are tearing the colony apart, it's no mystery who overthrew the government. They're also trying to kill Isaac because he's a threat to the markers in their plan. They intend on triggering another convergence for reasons that we don't fully understand at the moment. You then get the most dramatic introduction to stasis in the series as you use it to cause a wreck and stop incoming traffic. I like how the game is nice enough to let you know that the transports are unmanned so you're not killing any innocent people, as if the last game didn't have you going through an infected elementary school and compromising an entire bunker full of people. You make it to the extraction point where both Isaac and Carver are shot. The guards care enough to check to see if Isaac is alive, but they don't do the same to Carver. It's very possible that he had a cloaking unit along with his teleporter, or that the unitologists here are like dinosaurs and can't see you if you stand still, but it's not very clear. The big bad of the unitologists, Danik, shows you a nearby marker test lab, which he says are in every major colony and outpost. He then blows the facility up, which allows the marker signal to pass freely over the colony and start creating more necromorphs. Isaac finesses his way out of the situation before he's shot and falls onto a pile of dead bodies several floors down. Carver activated his teleporter when the unitologists weren't looking, so he's down here too. Norton decides that you're going to escape on a ship called the Eudora, and Isaac suggests taking a train to meet up with them. You fight your way to the train station and solve a simple telekinesis puzzle to get it started. Then fight your way up the train into the Eudora. Isaac tries to jump onto the ship but barely makes it, so Carver warps in front of him to try and help pull him aboard. Isaac then wakes up as if he was knocked unconscious and sees Carver looking at a photo of a woman and a young boy. Isaac asks about them, and Carver says it was his wife and son and that they were both killed by Danik. He's not very polite about it either. Norton calls you to the bridge, and you're given a brief moment to walk around the Eudora. As you do, you hear that Ellie came to this region thinking she found a way to stop the markers once and for all, and you see a half-destroyed moon when you arrive on the bridge. The ships in this graveyard belong to what's called the Sovereign Colonies and are over 200 years old. This is the same organization that we saw in the prologue, which means this is the same planet as well. An SOS is coming from one of the ships, and the Eudora is immediately destroyed when the pilot stupidly flies into a minefield. Isaac quickly assumes command and starts ordering Norton around, then goes to find a spacesuit. Once he does, you release the hinges on the room that Isaac told Norton to weld shut and go into one of those really fast flying sections. You're able to slow down the room and make your way inside the ship where Ellie's distress signal is coming from. Norton tells you to go investigate the distress beacon while he stays behind to release the rest of the crew from the room that was welded shut. This involves you restarting the generator and that puzzle I mentioned earlier, then both of you need to interact with the console to activate it. You take an elevator to the top floor where you see that Ellie is alive and well, and are not so subtly shown that she's also in a relationship with Norton. You're also introduced to two of our supporting cast, Buckle and Santos, or Science Lady as I usually refer to her as because I couldn't remember her name. For the sake of keeping the spirit of this playthrough alive, I'll be calling her that for the rest of this video. Ellie thanks you for coming, although Isaac is still a little put off after just seeing Norton inside her face a moment ago, and she explains that the admiral of this fleet wrote marker scrawl all over the walls of her quarters. You're the only one who can decipher it, and she says that we can't leave until you know what it says. Norton insists on leaving anyway, and Isaac tells her to go while he investigates the admiral's quarters. Ellie contacts Isaac in the elevator, and he immediately accuses her of moving on too fast. It's hinted that their relationship may have ended because Isaac refused to do more to stop the markers, and he once again demonstrates how little he wants to be involved in this life of necromorph hunting. There's a small detail I want to bring up here. The perceptive amongst you watching this video will notice that Ellie has both of her eyes in this game despite Strauss stabbing one out with a screwdriver in the last. You can actually see in some cutscenes that her eyes are two different colors, meaning that she got a transplant between the games. I actually really like how this is never brought up, and it's a small detail you can work out for yourself. It would feel a little inorganic for Isaac to bring up the surgery in this game, since it's something that would have been far enough in the past for them to have forgotten about it. You make your way to the Admiral's quarters and are introduced to the dual node puzzle along the way. The main reason I'm bringing this up is because of its functionality. On co-op, each of you controls one cursor as you make your way to the nodes, but on single player, you have to control both of them by yourself, easily making it one of the most taxing puzzles in the series. Once you make it there, Isaac goes into a trance upon looking at the Admiral's wall. Carver snaps him out of it, and Isaac tells Ellie that the Admiral was obsessed with making a key to an alien device that is capable of controlling the markers. She wanted to use the device to turn them off, which leads Ellie to believe that this planet is the marker's homeworld. Buckle suggests repairing a shuttle he found to reach the planet's surface, and Norton suggests using it to get back to Earth. Ellie tells him that you need to stop the markers or there won't be anything to go back to, and you basically settle by saying you'll repair the shuttle and decide what to do with it later. This is the moment where Norton becomes unbelievably petty towards Isaac for childish and stupid reasons. Gone is the calm and collective, finish the mission attitude that he was maintaining prior to finding Ellie. He will spite Isaac and push to go home at every opportunity, despite knowing that his own government has been overthrown and that the Necromorphs are likely running rampant as we speak. But as this next interaction shows, his problem is much more stupid than wanting to abort the mission.
Isaac, Norton here.
Why are you contacting me on a private channel?
Because I need to know if you're on my side.
We're taking sides now?
I know you two had a thing, but she's mine now, and I love her too much to let her do this.
If she's right and this is the marker homeworld, maybe there's a chance of stopping this.
Look, we both know how this is going to end. If they found a way to stop the markers 200 years ago, don't you think we'd all be safe by now? It doesn't add up. Oh, I get it. I get it. You think you and her... Yeah, we'll forget it. She's over it, all right?
So, yeah, Norton turns out to be an insecure man-child, and he will prove this fact time and time again throughout the course of the game. I could go on about this now, but I'd rather follow this plot point to its conclusion before I offer alternatives. There are a couple side missions you can do, or you can proceed with finding a way to repair the shuttle. As much as I'd like to say the missions specific to Carver are interesting, they're not. Every time I finished one, my reaction was, that was it? That was the whole quest? Here's a full rundown of Carver's background. He was a terrible husband and father, and he left his family thinking that they were better off without him. Danik then killed them, and now the marker is using his guilt to try and control him like it did Isaac. Carver decides that stopping the markers is the best bet for redemption, so he fully commits to that even if it kills him. This has the potential to be a really good character arc, but I imagine the developers ran out of time to properly implement it, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. You make your way to the largest ship in the graveyard, the Terra Nova. You pick up your first scavenger bot in this area, and you'll be told that there's a blockage that's preventing the tram from reaching you. This has you doing a quick puzzle to try and clear it, and since this only requires one person to complete, the game just turns it into a lazy defense section in co-op and spawns in waves of enemies to add a false sense of tension that already isn't there in the single player. A detail I like about this puzzle is that one of the cargo containers that you clear from the tram line is housing a necromorph, and you'll see when you return to the cargo room that it was Mr. Incredible. You're then put into a much more interesting defense section where you go fight off two Mr. Incredibles while waiting for the tram to arrive. You then proceed to another tram station where more show up, showing that you're not as safe as you might have thought. You then get to work creating a remote piloting device so Ellie can drive the shuttle to their location, which involves you looking for 3 components while enemies are on infinite respawn, until the game cheats and stops spawning them in for a brief second so you can use the workbench and build the part. You then proceed to refuel the engines, which requires both players to activate the console for some reason, then forces you to work together again as one of you has to hold down the nozzle while the other refills the tanks, then makes you both go activate the first console for a second time as if the first wasn't bad enough. Ellie tries to test fire the engines, but accidentally starts the launch sequence, proving that British people can't drive, and you have to scramble to find a way to open the hangar doors before the shuttle crashes into them. Mr. Incredible catches up with you in this room, and if you thought you were going to be smart and stasis him in front of the shuttle engines, you know, the way you killed the same enemy in the first game, then you're quickly shown that consistency wasn't a priority for this game because the fire doesn't even damage it. If it at least stunned it enough for you to get away, then I'd give this one a pass, but this is just ridiculous. Instead, the way you deal with them is by hopping on some turrets that are set up in a random room and shooting them while you try to blow the hinges off the hangar doors. I think you're supposed to be shooting them into space or something, but there's no animation tied to it since they just disappear whenever you shoot them. So what this section communicates to you is that fire, a proven way of dealing with these things, is ineffective, but gunshots, which is proven to not be able to kill them, works better somehow. Carver's teleporter malfunctions and causes Isaac to end up on the turret that he was using, and then you see as he's pulled back into position as Isaac is launched into space. Everybody cheers Isaac on as if Carver wasn't doing literally all the work on my playthrough, and you proceed with repairing the shuttle. The next couple of steps are basically fetch quests in space. Go remove this engine with telekinesis, which took me 10 minutes to figure out the first time I did it. Go get 3 nav cards from a few solar panels hanging around another ship. Go to a workbench and create the module, all the while Norton bitches about how it's too dangerous to keep going and how they should all just go home. I have no idea how Ellie has stayed satisfied with this man if he's so quick to pull out. Even Carver wants to at least try and stop the markers, and this is before he committed himself to doing it at all costs. Isaac eventually ends up being the deciding voice, much to Norton's dismay, and you get ready to take the shuttle to the planet. So, the game has been pretty boring up until this point, and all of that is about to change with this next sequence. The flight down to the planet has a couple of divergent gameplay moments. If you're on the single player run, you fly and shoot the guns at the same time. It mostly plays out like Superman 64 as you try to stay within the rings while shooting any debris. But if you're playing as Carver, then you take control of the turret as Isaac flies, even though you're still clearly looking at it from where Isaac is sitting. Your flight doesn't go very smoothly as you navigate the debris field and you lose multiple crew members along the way. Isaac goes to reseal the oxygen tanks that came loose when you hit some debris, so control is transferred to Carver, allowing him now to fly and shoot at the same time. Another piece of debris kills the navigator, so Ellie steps in to fill his role as Isaac takes back the flight controls. You're forced to crash land on the planet, which rips the shuttle in half, taking Ellie with it. Carver is only with you if you're doing co-op. Isaac wakes up to find his helmet is malfunctioning. Carver apparently wakes up at the exact same time, and you both start to freeze to death. Your temperature meter is similar to an oxygen meter, except you refill it by standing close to fires. You stop losing body heat when indoors, but you don't regain it until you find a generator to activate some heaters. Isaac insists on finding Ellie while Carver shouts at him that she's dead. The environments are extremely harsh, as you can see by my resource drone getting stuck in the snow, and he doesn't think there's any way that she could have survived. Carver tells Isaac not to get his hopes up seconds before you see a video recorded by Ellie telling Isaac that she'll be dropping flares so they can find her. You see that Norton is basically telling her the same thing Carver is telling Isaac, that there's no way you survived and you're probably dead. You're then jumped by a giant necromorph monster that flings Isaac to the opposite end of a gorge, and Carver hilariously comes flying in immediately afterwards. You proceed forward until you find a shelter where Buckle is freezing to death. He's still alive, but it's too late to save him. He tells you that there weren't enough snowsuits to go around, so he agreed to stay behind so the rest could live. They didn't check the basement because they could hear scratching noises coming from there and didn't want to risk it. I feel the need to point out that there are heaters in this room, and they could have at least tried to get the generator going before just leaving him to die. But maybe they did and we just aren't told that. You need to use kinesis to turn them on, and I think you and Carver are the only ones that have them. This makes it even more awkward on single player because Carver isn't with you. He's with Ellie and the gang. He could easily turn this generator on, but he lets Buckle die anyways, I guess. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on. The basement area is this game's elementary school. Wow, that sounds really bad out of context. It's full of fodder enemies that are functionally a replacement to the more controversial ones from the last game, and the entire area is very dark. The enemies blend in with the rusty backgrounds, and they throw hordes of them at you. The audio logs down here detail how they were running out of food, so many of the people decided to eat the Necromorphs to avoid starving, which is what turned them into these things. Slowly. The sole survivor had to hide to avoid being eaten by them, but they were still sentient while they were hunting him.
I think there may be a way around them. By throwing small objects, I can trick them into investigating the noise.
Ackerman! Is that you?
Oh, God.
I smell you! I smell... fresh meat!
You get the snowsuits while down here, which means you won't need to worry about temperature management again for the rest of the game, and you can proceed with searching for Ellie. You make your way to another facility where a unique cutscene will play depending on what mode you're on. If you're on single player, then Carver is watching the perimeter and sends down the elevator for you before being pushed back by some necromorphs. If you're on co-op, then Carver confronts Isaac and tells him that he's not going to let any distractions get in the way of their mission, including Isaac's obsession with Ellie. Honestly, Isaac has been borderline distant compared to how Norton is acting, which makes me wonder if Carver is trying to cover for him here, or legitimately just doesn't pay attention to what's going on. Up next is the worst boss in the entire game, and this isn't the only time you're going to fight it. This is a large necromorph that requires you to shoot its tentacles off before it reveals a different set. You shoot those off, then rinse and repeat. This is fine, but the fight has problems. For one, it likes to charge you, and don't think for a second that you can dodge out of the way, because you'll get hit anyways. You're better off hitting it with stasis and running. This can be annoying since it likes to knock you down and then hit you with a follow-up attack before you finish recovering from the first one. This makes the fight feel cheap, and it can drag if you don't use explosives to sever all the tentacles at once. Necromorphs. If you do, then the fight is a complete joke. It will run off before you have a chance to kill it, creating a ramp you can use to get into the facility in the process. You get inside and make contact with Ellie, then make your way to meet up with the rest of the crew. Ellie gives Isaac a hug, which is enough to make Norton start acting like a child again. I'd be hard-pressed to think anybody likes him by this point, and I'd say he's written to be unlikable, but even that doesn't serve a purpose in this story. You move outside with the group, but are separated whenever Danik's men arrive to try and kill you. Norton bitches that they're after Isaac and he's putting everybody in danger. You fight a puzzle boss by hitting the drill with stasis and shooting its core, then meet up with everybody else. I'm going through this kind of fast because not a lot of what you do here is very interesting. What is interesting would be the giant frozen necromorph in the center of the room. Science Lady tells you that the researchers called them the Nexus, and they believe that they broadcast the marker signal to the smaller necromorphs. They use the signal from within the Nexus to track the machine, the not so cleverly named MacGuffin of this game, so we're going to do the same. This is a lot of walking around for what amounts to a little bit of content, so allow me to summarize what you do here. You start off by going to the roof and turning on the furnace. Ellie contacts Isaac shortly after to thank him for putting up with Norton. She tells you that he hasn't been acting himself lately. No, girl, he's being his true self right now.
Is that Isaac? Great. You two having a nice little chat?
He just called to say he got the furnace going. He's on his way back now.
You then solve a quick puzzle to get the thawing process started, then you return to Science Lady so you can get the blueprints to build a sensor gun to track the signal to the machine. Norton basically calls you crazy and stupid for thinking you can turn off the markers, which makes sense considering that he's an expert on turn-offs. You can learn in one of the rooms on the way to the warehouse that the Sovereign Colonies was given a cleanse order, which is also something that you could have learned on the Terra Nova during a side mission. This basically meant kill everybody around you and then kill yourself, which is why General Mahad did what he did in the prologue. You reach the warehouse and start grabbing the parts for the sensor gun, and there's yet another stupid puzzle that requires 2 people despite it being a one-man job in single player. You then get back outside and have to fight the boss from earlier again with no alterations to how the fight functions. It once again runs off before you can kill it, so you make your way back to the Nexus. Norton once again tries to convince you to leave, saying that if you care at all about Ellie, you'll get her off the planet. Isaac says that you're the only hope for saving the human race, and Norton says that the only hope you have of surviving is getting off the planet. You pry the Nexus chest open, and, with your sensor gun in hand, get inside the shark cage to be lowered into its body. Norton is told to help you get there, which makes sense if Carver is with you, but doesn't if you're playing single player, since Carver would be the obvious choice to help you here. You descend into the Nexus, shoot 3 clusters, and fight off a few waves of enemies, then get back in the cage once Science Lady has the machine's location. For whatever reason, Carver can't hear this next conversation despite it being crucial to the plot. This isn't a private conversation either, since everybody except Carver is present, so I have no idea why he can't hear it. Science Lady tells you that the machine is far below the planet's surface, and there's an entrance to it further up the mountain. Norton says it's impossible to get further up the mountain due to the cliffs, and Ellie says they saw some climbing gear in the facility. She says that she and Science Lady will go set it up, and ask that Norton make sure you get out there safely. Norton then has his lowest moment when this happens.
I love you. You know that, right?
What? Yeah, of course. Isaac, meet us at the cliff.
Got it.
In response to that sad display, Norton decides to do something very stupid. In his infinite wisdom, he decides to leave you locked in the cage while he goes to save Ellie. You're forced to use kinesis to open it so you can progress. If Carver is here, aka if you're playing co-op, he says absolutely nothing about Norton locking him in the cage. He just sits there. He doesn't comment on it after you leave. Nothing. On top of this, Norton jammed Isaac's signal so he couldn't warn Ellie, and I understand that Carver doesn't really care, but he really should have the foresight to say something since Norton is actively compromising the mission, which is something Carver took the time to confront Isaac about before you reunited with the group.
We came to this frozen shithole to stop the markers, and nothing, not you or your obsession with Ellie, is gonna get in my way. You got that?
Why does Carver have nothing to say here? The scene only gets worse after you step outside and are grabbed by Danik's men. If you're on single player, then Carver teleports in at the wrong time and gets grabbed too, which is bullshit because we all know he could just teleport away. Danik is here too, and he tells you that Norton is the one who told him how to get here. He struck a deal where he would trade you for a way off the planet, and Isaac tells Danik to let everybody else go now that they have him. It's not clear when Norton had time to contact Danik either, seeing as he had no reason to resort to this until after the shuttle was destroyed when entering the planet, and he was convinced you were dead after crash landing. There's only about a minute between him learning you're still alive and Danik's men arriving. Shock space travel is shown to be a timely process, and he couldn't have contacted Danik within this minute because he was with Ellie and Science Lady the whole time. Danik reveals that he has no intentions of letting any of you go, and Norton pathetically tries to tell him that they had a deal. He tells him that he can't afford to leave any of you alive and goes to shoot Norton, but Isaac manages to free himself and tackles him before he can. This gives Carver enough time to spring into action too, killing one of the unitologists, and Isaac throws a grenade at Danik, who ends up running away. It literally did nothing. You get ready to have a shootout when the Nexus wakes up and starts attacking. Norton sits there with his thumb up his ass while you and Carver try to kill the Nexus. Just like the hive mind, it can be taken out by shooting its glowing spots. Once you destroy them, it super sucks you in, and you destroy more glowing spots inside it. This causes it to spit you back out, and it finally dies. As for the next scene, I'll just let it play out.
Whoa! You made us come down here. You encouraged her. Now look where we are. Between Danik shooting at us and whatever the fuck that was, what chance have we got? You betrayed us! I tried to save us. You are the real problem here, Clark, but not anymore. Captain! Stand down, Sergeant. This is all your fucking fault. She doesn't love you.
Fuck.
Come on. He won't stay dead forever, not around here.
What am I gonna tell Ellie?
Hey, you tell her the truth. Now let's go.
Isaac picks something up off his coat, and it's a torn photo of Ellie, the same one that Norton picked up back in Isaac's apartment. Apparently this was all it took for him to view Isaac as a threat to his relationship, and instead of talking things out like a damn adult, he decided to try and kill him instead. I hope you guys were looking forward to a tangent in this video, because I have a plethora of issues with this scene. For starters, this whole Norton versus Isaac fight over Ellie's heart isn't interesting, but worse than that, it doesn't add any depth to the story. There's no development between Isaac and Ellie's character. This doesn't even really cause problems with Isaac and Carver. He yells at him a couple times, but that's about it. In fact, Carver doesn't even seem to have a relationship with Norton given how little they've interacted with each other. There's nothing in the game to imply that they're even close, and Norton gives so few orders in this game that it's easy to forget that he's a captain at all. You could argue that everybody undermining his authority is what led to him snapping, but if that's the case, it isn't communicated well enough to the player. He only ever suggests things, he never gives orders. There's no dynamic between him and his crew, so there's no reason for his death to have any impact on Isaac and Carver's already strained relationship. This conflict also lacks any real subtlety. Nobody is going to sympathize with Norton because he's acting like a child. He's extremely possessive over Ellie and starts several arguments over her simply talking to Isaac, much less the blowout you had when she gave him a hug, which makes sense considering that they've been through a lot together. I think anybody would be relieved that somebody they care about is alive, even if their relationship didn't work out in the past. So for Norton to think that she would be indifferent to Isaac's death shows an obscene amount of naivety. All this really does is reinforce that Norton is a bad guy and Isaac's a good guy, which means that there's no nuance to this conflict whatsoever. Let's now tackle the stupidity of Norton's thought process. He keeps pushing to go home when he knows that the government he represents has been overthrown and he is now firmly an enemy of the state. That's ignoring the Necromorph threat that is undoubtedly spread to Earth by this point. Ellie has been telling him several times that there is no home to go back to. They're going to be on the run regardless, so you may as well press ahead. It's never made clear why he can't acknowledge that. Then there's the problem of him not accepting responsibility for his own actions. Even after trying to hand Isaac over to Danik, he still stops him from killing Norton. He then demonstrates that he is more than capable of taking out even the biggest Necromorphs, and yet Norton still tries to kill him right here. I would have completely forgiven his stupidity if he finally accepted responsibility for his own actions, admitted that he was wrong, and ceased all hostilities with Isaac right then and there as a show of good faith. The conflict would still be stupid, but it wouldn't be as stupid if Norton eventually came around, but he doesn't. He tries to kill Isaac anyways. Then there's the issue with Carver and how he really should have been the one to shoot Norton here. It makes much more sense. He's endangering the mission by threatening to kill Isaac. He's clearly deranged and he needs to be put down. The only reason the writers didn't do this is because then Isaac wouldn't have to face Ellie about Norton's death. But as we're about to see, she gets over it so quickly that it doesn't actually matter. It's never brought up again and all is forgiven in about 5 minutes, so why did they sacrifice the logical conclusion to this problem just to force some arbitrary confrontation with Ellie? Carver has made it clear he doesn't care about this quarrel between them, but why does he only hold Isaac to this standard? Carver not shooting Norton only makes sense if he is shown to have some rapport with him, but as we already went into, he doesn't. So, at the end of the day, this entire plot point was meaningless, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't potential. The writers really should have made Norton a great guy who cares deeply for Ellie but is committed to this mission. Instead of him being a petty schoolboy, Isaac would be the one who is gruff towards him because he's upset that Ellie moved on so quickly. He wouldn't go as far as starting confrontations, but he would be very cold towards him nonetheless. This conflict, now far less loud than the current one, would be about Isaac coming to terms with the fact that Ellie is now better off with somebody who is, in many ways, the antithesis of who he is. Isaac is an engineer who is only here begrudgingly, whereas Norton is a soldier who is far more idealistic about the situation, just like Ellie, which is a logical progression for her since Isaac's lack of care about stopping the markers is what drove them apart in the first place. This automatically makes Norton more likable and down to earth as a character, and it gives Isaac a chance to grow emotionally, something he hasn't been able to do since coming to terms with him losing Nicole. At around the time that Isaac begins to accept that he and Ellie are done for good, Norton is killed in a fight with Danik's men. Literally, all you need to do is remove the lines about how tracking somebody through shock space is impossible, and it's now possible. None of the previous games made this a rule. Now, you have a meaningful death with a character that the player undoubtedly likes more than Norton as he is now, and you still get the conflict of Isaac facing Ellie and having to tell her that her boyfriend is dead. Maybe make it to where she asks Isaac to keep Norton safe instead of the other way around. She likely wouldn't believe that Isaac did everything he could to save him due to how he was treating him up until that point, and you still get that slight wedge in their relationship, although she needs to take much more time to get over it than she does currently. Notice that I'm being light on details here. That's because I'm not a writer, and I would rather provide an outline that somebody more seasoned could take and fill in the details about. I think this would have been better for Isaac's character than what happens now, and I wish Norton actually had a brain in this game. Unfortunately for the story, this isn't even the worst part. After severing all of Norton's limbs and or teabagging his dead body, you make your way to meet up with the rest of the crew. You're probably wondering how Isaac is going to explain this to Ellie. Surely, at the very least, he's going to mention the fact that Norton locked you in a cage and tried to hand you over to Danik, right?
I shot him, Ellie. What? I'm sorry. I had no choice.
Norton betrayed us, Ellie. He was ready to kill us. Isaac did what he had to do to save the mission. Come on. We gotta keep moving.
Now there are only 4 of us left. I can't do this.
Then we leave you behind. If you can't keep your head, you're a danger to everybody.
You're horrible.
Nobody's leaving anybody. Now, come on. Let's get to the top of this mountain. Together. Together.
I could easily go on another tangent about this scene, but I think the piss-poor delivery speaks for itself. It really feels like the writers went out of their way to make this explanation feel as unnatural as humanly possible. This brings us to quite possibly the buggiest part of the game. You need to climb up several cliff faces while looking for something to raise the rest of the crew in. Ellie starts accusing you of killing Norton to sabotage the mission, saying that you're only here because you were held at gunpoint. Let's ignore the fact that Isaac has done literally everything up until now, but sure, we're here to sabotage the mission. They then get attacked by something, and Ellie radios in a couple minutes later saying that they were able to drive it off. She then tells you that she doesn't understand why Norton would try to kill you, so Isaac explains that he was pissed that you kept pushing to move forward when Norton wanted to go home. Ellie says that she thought he understood that the mission was all that mattered, proving that even she wasn't paying attention to the dozen or so arguments they had while he was insisting on going home. This is the moment that Ellie and Isaac repair their relationship, a mere 5 or so minutes after it fell apart. So now is the time that I can zoom out and start generalizing the tasks you do, because there's a lot of game left, but it can be summarized pretty easily. But first, we need to talk about Dead Space 3's buggiest moment. You need to climb up this cliff face that has large rocks and a swinging cage to avoid. You slow the rocks with stasis to try and get past them, but if any one of these things touch you, you die instantly. This wouldn't be a problem, but the game really likes to kill you here. There's a gap you need to jump across to avoid one of the large rocks, and if you don't jump on a very specific part of it, then the game won't let you across. You'll just slip and go back to where you were before the jump. This doesn't pair well with the fact that the game will sometimes kill you with empty air. It thinks that the rock is falling on you, but it isn't. The problem with this is that the jumping and slipping collisions aren't consistent, so it feels like you're having to brute force your way through the glitches in order to get through. You make it to the top and start raising a cage with everybody in it. Once they reach the top, Science Lady starts talking about how scared she was and how she can't wait to get back on solid ground, all while she stands on the cage. The giant monster that's been hounding you shows up and starts trying to drag down the cage. Isaac tries to save Science Lady, but Carver says that it's too heavy and the monster is going to bring the cliff face down with them. Ellie stands in the background with her thumb up her ass, so maybe her and Norton really were good for each other after all. Carver then pulls out an axe that he didn't have before and cuts the line. This is really weird when you're playing as Carver and he just randomly summons this axe like it's Stormbreaker. Maybe that's how he's been doing all the teleporting around, he was just using the Bifrost the whole time. Isaac falls off the cliff face and has to fight the monster one more time. You can't win this fight by conventional means, despite the fact that it won't run away no matter how much damage you do. You need to use these conveniently placed harpoons to rip it in half. The game doesn't necessarily make sure you see the harpoons either. There's some dialogue where he tells Carver to get them working again, but this can trigger whether or not you are actually looking at them. Once it's dead, you circle back to the top and Ellie reassures Isaac that he's not a piece of shit. He apologizes to her for giving up on the world, and this is meant to be the moment when he realizes he could have been doing more the whole time. If you'll excuse the repetition, I think this would have been more impactful if we had my alternate fanfiction Norton story where Isaac saw just how much these things mattered to Ellie and how he could be doing more. In the current state that it is, this feels a little undeserved. Let's speed up now. You make your way to the Rosetta lab so you can find somebody named Rosetta. She helped the researchers build the original codex and is the key to building another one. You find the lab where you see that they cut her life into pieces as a last resort. You track these pieces down as Danik taunts you over the intercom, and you send them back to the Rosetta lab so you can get to work reassembling her. This is a fairly interesting puzzle as you try to assemble the pieces in the right order, and once you do, you see that Rosetta isn't even a person. She's an alien. They pulled the information for the codex from her brain that was kept preserved in the ice. After starting the data transfer, Isaac sees a vision that gives us some real answers about the planet you're on. This isn't the marker homeworld. It was an alien world that was infested by the Necromorphs when their species discovered the marker, just like Earth is now. The markers pulled all the infected bodies together to form one final stage of a Necromorph and the source of the signal, a moon. The same moon you saw when you first arrived in the system. The moon is Convergence, and the machine was built to freeze the planet and halt it in its tracks. Isaac explains that if the machine shuts down, then the entire planet will thaw and the Convergence will resume, allowing the markers to spread everywhere. Isaac didn't think to look up while explaining all this, so Danik now has all the information. The unitologist stormed the building and detained everybody while you were out, and they now have the codex. Danik, being the psychopath he is, plans to shut down the machine and resume the Convergence. He says that by doing this, all humanity will be made whole. Isaac activates the incinerators in the room whenever Danik isn't looking, and it starts filling the room with, as Carver puts it, gas that eats your face. Ellie enters the control booth to unlock the doors while you and Carver head for the exit, but Ellie is cut off by the gas. She tells Isaac that she loves him, and you're forced to leave her behind to die off screen, which means she isn't dead at all. Carver does his best to keep him going, and Isaac decides it's time to turn into a murdering psychopath. You chase Danik to a silo that he's using to go underground, and you rappel down to follow him. You can hear from an audio log that the phrase, "turn it off," that the Admiral was writing down was just another deception by the marker, because it was the machine that it wanted you to turn off the whole time, not the marker signal. You can also learn that this isn't the only moon. There are a network of brethren moons, and if this one manages to complete, it will call the others to come to our system looking for food. However, you can use the codex to tune the machine to destroy the moon and prevent this from happening. You then get your first alien glyph audio puzzle where the answer is almost always written down, or the door itself will tell you what sound it's looking for and the subtitles will give it away. This is basically like having a lock screen on your computer that flashes the letters of your password. You then get a good look at the machine, and Carver arrives to enjoy the view. He then asks Isaac to promise him that he'll get this done even if he doesn't make it. The conversation goes like this.
We'll get this done, Carver. You and me.
Yeah, but if I don't... I helped get us this far. And that's close enough for all this to count, right?
Count for what?
For... I don't know, just... all the bad I've done.
Oh, shut up, Carver. You're a good man.
I alienated my son, wrecked my family. Isaac, I killed Santos. Is that what a good man does?
Good men mean well. You just don't always end up doing well.
Hey, I'm sorry about Ellie, man.
Me too. Me too.
This is the closest these two get to having a real bonding moment, and it's completely ruined on single-player mode because none of it makes any sense. Without doing co-op, you don't get to see how Carver is affected by the marker's hallucinations, and you don't learn anything about how he treated his family. It was this conversation alone that made me want to play co-op and get the context behind the scene, and I'm very sad to say that it was underwhelming. You and Carver are separated after a bridge collapses, which is probably the first time the game gives context for you two being split up outside of a cutscene. Isaac contacts Danik and tries to tell him what he learned about the moons, but he doesn't listen. You catch up with him and have a struggle for the codex, which you win and fall to the lower part of the city. The following sequence goes like this. Do a basic puzzle involving these platforms that amplify telekinesis and stasis, move to another part of the city, which is revealed to be not a city, but the machine itself. Do some combat, move to another part of the machine, solve another puzzle, activate something, backtrack, do another combat encounter with 6 of these tanky-ass alien necromorphs, Fight your way to where you solve the first puzzle to redo it, then turn around and go back to where you just came from. Danik reveals that Ellie is alive, to no one's surprise. She escaped through those delivery tubes where you were sending the Rosetta pieces to. Danik says he'll meet you at the heart of the machine so you can hand over the codex. You solve one final puzzle to open the door to the heart, and Isaac radios Carver and lets him know. You then rappel up to the top and see that Carver has already teleported there ahead of you. The bastard didn't even have the common courtesy to let you know. Danik threatens to kill Ellie if you don't hand over the codex. Ellie tells you not to do it, and Carver grabs the codex and gives it to Danik in exchange for Ellie's life. You may see this as character progression, I see it as a forced way to progress the plot. Nobody shoots Danik when he has his back turned, they just let him shut off the machine and get impaled by a falling spike. Isaac tells Ellie to take Danik's shuttle and leave so you can try and kill the moon. Carver tries to get Isaac to leave with her, but he refuses, saying that he's the only one who can stop it. Isaac then tells Ellie that he's done turning his back on the world and that he's not afraid of what needs to be done anymore. He tells her not to come back for you, and she leaves to return to Earth. The moon starts tearing the machine apart, preventing you from reaching the control panel that either of them could have run up and shut off at any time, but they all waited for no reason. You use one of the alien boosters that helped you get around the machine during your backtracking spree to get closer to the control panel, and you end up inside the moon. The piece of land you found yourself on has one of those superkinesis panels, so the fight mostly consists of waiting around for you to circle around to the moon's eye and shooting a marker at it. I'd like to say this has some relevance to the whole needle in the eye theme the series had going, but there's no way to be sure. It's probably just a happy accident. Despite this boss being extremely simple, I love the spectacle of it, and the thought of Isaac taking out this giant necromorph moon is very cool to me. Once you've destroyed all 3 eyes, the moon swallows the control panel and you literally pull it out of its stomach with superkinesis, which is a perfect way to end this fight. You then flip the switch on the machine to destroy the moon, although how that works when so much of it was torn up in the vortex, I'm not sure. Carver and Isaac accept their death, and Ellie tries to contact them as the moon is destroyed. She then sees that the marker signal is gone and returns to Earth. You can hear at the end of the credits that Isaac is still alive. I'm not going to go into this ending right now since I'll be touching it more in the DLC discussion, but there are a couple of loose ends that I need to tie up, most of which are pertaining to the lore. Something that stuck out to me throughout the entire series is that the marker in the first game clearly wanted Isaac to stop the Necromorphs and painted the hive mind as the source of them, but the later titles prove that this isn't the case. I believe this to be a simple retcon, and I don't want to linger on this topic for too long, but I did want to acknowledge the inconsistency. We also need to wrap up a question that I haven't posed. What does "make us whole" mean? It's become clear that this phrase means 3 different things depending on the context. In the first game, this means that the marker needs to be placed back on its pedestal, thus making it whole. In the second game, it means that the body of the marker's maker needs to be consumed in order to officially trigger the convergence. And in the third game, it is literally the convergence. All the Necromorphs come together to form a new moon, thus being made whole. I like that this has multiple meanings depending on what's going on, and 2 of them are related to each other. We still have one more thing to talk about, and it's the DLC. This only took me about an hour to get through, and seeing as I read online that this could take 3 to 4 hours, I was very disappointed. There's not much to really talk about since my main focus is going to be on the ending, but there is some discussion to find here. For starters, those of you watching are probably wondering how Isaac and Carver are alive. It's a pretty big question. How did they survive that ending? Well, the writer's grand explanation mostly consists of lampshading the issue and moving on, telling the player that it must have been the alien technology around the machine that saved their life. This is not only a stupid and unsatisfying answer, it sets a rotten foundation for the rest of the DLC, and I'll explain at the end why we can't proceed with the theory that it isn't canon. Here's the main plot of the DLC. Isaac and Carver wake up and are unsure how they're still alive. Isaac says, well, it was probably all that alien tech that we don't understand, and then says this.
I quit trying to make sense of it all back on the Ishimura.
Hopefully, everybody watching can agree that a better explanation could have been thought of than that. You proceed forward and get a shot of the dead moon. This causes the boys to conclude that the Necromorphs are no longer a threat. They both receive a telepathic message from something shortly after, and Isaac runs into a Necromorph Norton, despite the fact that I very clearly cut off all his limbs. This is a level of continuity breakage that I can't stomach. The boys realize that the Necromorph threat is still very much alive, and they decide that they need to get back to Earth and warn everybody. So that's what you do for the entire DLC. You spend some time running around the planet until you find a shuttle that can take you to the Terra Nova, and then you spend some time trying to repair its shock drive so you can get back to Earth. It becomes apparent that the moon you killed managed to establish a link with the other ones, and they contact Isaac telling him that he will lead them to Earth. Isaac then fights with Carver about how they can't go home or else Earth is in jeopardy, and is later revealed that the moons were only stalling for time and it's too late to warn Earth now. You scramble to finish the shock drive and head back to Earth as fast as you can, but you arrive too late. The moons are already there and they're already in the process of consuming the planet. Then the credits roll. This was the biggest disappointment for me. The cliffhanger ending for a sequel that we never got is bad enough, but what's worse is the fact that this ending is canon. Just like the first game, the first letter of every mission in Dead Space 3 forms a sentence, and this one says, "Brother Moons are awake." The thing that disappoints me so much about the ending is the fact that 1, it's really damn cool, and 2, it lacks any narrative closure. The ending to the base game, while not particularly great, was at the very least conclusive. The DLC sets up a story that has the potential of being interesting but will likely never be told. Of course, some of you thinking this ending is conclusive, it's the end of the world. You're not wrong, I can totally see that interpretation, but I still feel like there's more to be said here. The Brethren Moons are the coolest concept the games have introduced up until this point, and I wish we would have gotten an entire game to explore it. This was the moment that the series fully commits to its cosmic horror elements. The idea of sentient moons that consume entire planets may sound a little silly on paper, but it ends up working because of how much setup it has. These aren't just sentient moons, their body is made up of seemingly an entire species that was infected by the Necromorphs, which means they're basically planet-sized balls of decomposing flesh. If you were following the game's various artifacts, which are text logs that provide more lore details than the regular ones, you can learn that it's no coincidence that the aliens of Tau Volantis, the planet you were on for much of the game, befell a similar fate as yourself. The markers spread the signal that are received from the moons, but it does more than just create necromorphs and cause dementia. The whole purpose is to push a species to evolve in such a way that it overpopulates itself and depletes its resources. The markers are a limitless source of energy, but it's an energy that can never be harnessed. It then drives people insane, eventually infesting them to the point of triggering convergence and creating a new moon, which summons the rest of them to consume an entire galaxy of all life before going into hibernation, then the process repeats. The moons become truly terrifying when you realize that each one represents a spacefaring species that has been manipulated and consumed by the markers, but it's those very markers that led to the evolution that got that species to the point in the first place. It's no coincidence that the marker itself is in the shape of a double helix, just like our own DNA. This creatively twists two opposing theories in astronomy. The Fermi paradox, which states that the sheer size of the universe suggests that at least some advanced civilizations must exist, and the Great Filter, which states that our lack of ability to find advanced life means that there's a barrier somewhere that prevents it from thriving. Unlike the Reapers in Mass Effect, the moons also play into some biological concepts like convergent evolution, which is essentially the independent evolution of similar features in different species. There's a log that details how the physiology of aliens like Rosetta are similar to that of our own. I'm not an expert on astronomy, but if the sheer number of NASA documentaries I've watched over the years are anything to go by, then the lack of evidence of intelligent life, or even other habitable planets, is a mystery we still haven't figured out yet. I, in my very unprofessional opinion, have always felt that one of the reasons we struggle to find it is because of our limited ability to view the universe in real time. From what I understand, the way that light travels through space causes objects seen through the Hubble Space Telescope to be viewed in the past. A flawed explanation would be that if a planet is 4 light years away, then that is how long it is taken for the beam of light to reach us, and thus what we see appears as it did 4 years ago. Think of it as somebody mailing you a photo of a landscape that takes 2 weeks to arrive. You're seeing a snapshot of that landscape as it was 2 weeks ago, although you wouldn't really consider it staring back in time either. The complicated nature of this problem means that, theoretically, another advanced species equally as far from us could be seeing Earth at a point that predates our civilization. However, there's still the possibility that the reason we can't find any evidence of advanced civilizations is because something killed it. The moons are a play on these scientific concepts. If we were to view the universe with the context of Dead Space's lore, then the reason we can't find any evidence of advanced life is because they were wiped out by the moons, and the reason we can't find any habitable planets is because the moons consumed every living thing in that star system, leaving it completely barren. This concept is horrifying. It shows how insignificant our species is, how everything we've accomplished isn't due to our own ability or anything that creationism might suggest, it's because we were guided by the markers for our entire existence. The miracle of evolution that led to our creation wasn't a miracle at all. It was deliberate. We were being controlled by forces we never understood for centuries, and now these godlike entities have come to strip our planet of all life. And it's for this reason that I can't say that I hate Dead Space 3 despite its flaws. It introduced the greatest and most terrifying piece of lore into the universe, and unlike the Reapers in Mass Effect, the moons are genuinely terrifying. This isn't a cycle that wipes out life every 20,000 years, it's a cycle that creates life with the purpose of consuming it in every other planet in the galaxy. There are 7 of these moons that are still alive, and you can't even credit yourself for killing one since the machine predates your existence. 7 species had fallen for the same trap that humanity did. I wish we could have gotten an entire game to explore this threat, and I wish we would get to see how this ends. So, this brings us to our conclusions. As you can tell, I have a lot of thoughts about the series, and not all of them are great. I don't think that these 3 games could be more different from each other, even though the second game clearly shares the most DNA with the other 2. All of them have their strengths and weaknesses, many of which we just went through, but none of them are complete failures, including the third game. As much as I tore that last one apart for its various contrivances and shitty writing, I can't deny that the expansion of the universe with the Brethren Moons is the greatest thing it brings to the table. I've come to classify these games by what they were trying to achieve. Do you want a game that focuses on horror above all else? Play the first Dead Space. Do you want a game that focuses more on action and isn't that scary? Play Dead Space 3. Do you want the greatest balance between these two? Play Dead Space 2. Even though Dead Space 3 fails in many areas, I think the right person would still get some enjoyment out of it. I honestly hope the Dead Space remake is good, and I hope that it's successful enough to where EA greenlights a fourth game to finish up the story. By this point, Isaac has accepted his role as the go-to guy for marker extermination, and I would like to see him strap up one more time to end the Necromorph threat once and for all. Dead Space, to me, is like Mass Effect's distant cousin that is darker and edgier, and it deserves some finality to its universe. I sincerely hope we get to see that someday. Thanks for watching, guys. As you can tell, this video came together very quickly. I started it back on September 30th, and I pulled a couple 15-hour days to get it done, but I'm proud of how fast that I did. I want to thank everybody for the positive reception I received on the Greedfall video. I beat my head against the wall for months to finish it, and it had the most successful launch of all my videos to date. Thank you to everybody who watched it, and welcome everybody who subscribed since I released it. I'd like to give everybody a heads up that my next video will be much larger than anything I've attempted so far, and I don't really have an idea of how long the finished product will be. I'm going to try and have it finished in a month and a half, but I can't promise that right now. If you made it this far, then you deserve to know that I've left an Easter egg of my own in the video's description. To some of you who are fans of the series, I've already given that away, but for the rest of you, that's the only hint I'll give. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.